Frost hangs thick over the gravel lot. 40 skeletal bison stand silent in the farthest pen, pressed into a perfect ring, the weakest huddled at the center. An old cow holds the front, legs shaking, refusing to fall. No one steps forward. A single paddle rises high from the back of the crowd. Laughter cracks open. A man's voice cuts clean through the cold. Bury them before the holidays, or the smell will do the job for you. The gavel falls. Sold. The herd shifts as one. The old cow turns and leaves. The woman walks toward the pen, coat pulled tight, while the morning light still refuses to rise, and the hours left to move them begin to burn. Red Hollow, in the autumn of 1883, was the kind of town that noticed everything and forgave nothing. Odessa Kane had learned that the hard way, over 2 winters, the way you learn where the floorboards creak in a house that was never really yours to begin with. She'd learned it in the dry goods store, where the clerk's eyes moved over her a half-second too long before landing on her coin purse. She'd learned it at church, in the space left empty beside her on the pew, wide enough for 2 people who never came. She'd learned it most of all in the particular silence that fell whenever she walked into a room full of ranchers discussing land, cattle, prices, a silence that wasn't quite rude, wasn't quite polite either, just careful. The kind of careful you extend to something you've already decided doesn't belong. She'd stopped waiting for that to change. Sunday last, at service, she'd arrived a few minutes late. A wheel had come loose on the wagon, nothing serious, just enough to cost her the time, and found the whole congregation already settled, already turned partway toward the door the way congregations do when a latecomer walks in. She'd felt every eye on her the length of the aisle, felt the particular weight of being looked at not as a person arriving, but as a shape arriving, a size, a widowed silhouette taking up more of the doorway than the room seemed prepared to make room for. She'd sat in her usual pew, the one with space enough beside her for 2 people who never came, and old Mrs. Iverson, 2 rows up, had leaned to whisper something to her daughter, and the daughter had glanced back, quick, and looked away just as quick when she caught Odessa watching. Odessa hadn't asked what was said, didn't need to. She'd been fluent in that particular unspoken dialect for 2 years now. The glance, the lean, the whisper cut short. She could read a room's opinion of her from clear across a church without a single word reaching her ears, and there was no comfort in that fluency at all, only a tired, practiced kind of endurance. She'd sung the hymns anyway, sat up straight the way Caleb used to tell her to, left when it ended without lingering to talk, because lingering only ever invited more of the same, dressed up as friendly concern. That was Sunday. Wednesday was the auction. Her husband, Caleb, had died 2 years back, thrown from a half-broke gelding on a stretch of ground so ordinary she still couldn't drive past it without her hands tightening on the reins. He'd left her 160 acres, a house with a leaning porch, a debt at the bank that grew a little each season like something with its own appetite, and a silence about certain parts of his past that Odessa had never thought to question. Why would she? A dead man's secret seemed like the least urgent problem in the world, right up until they aren't. She was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, broad through the hips, built like the women in her mother's family had always been built, sturdy, capable, made for carrying weight, though Red Hollow preferred a different word for it. Preferred it behind cupped hands, in doorway, in the particular pause before somebody said "poor thing," all alone out there, and you'd think she'd at least, and then let the sentence trail off into something they didn't quite have the nerve to finish out loud. She'd gotten good at not finishing it for them either. That morning, the morning that would end up cracking her whole life open like a dropped egg, she had exactly one plan. Drive into the county seat, buy scrap wire cheap off the liquidation lot at the old Salt Fork Wildlife Ranch, which had gone under sometime over the summer, the way half the small operations in the county seemed to be going under lately. Fix the north fence before the first real freeze. Come home. Nothing more ambitious than that. Otis Granger had mentioned it to her outside the feed store 3 days prior, chewing on a toothpick, not looking at her directly the way most men in town had a habit of not looking at her directly. They're clearing the whole property, he'd said. Bank wants it emptied by week's end. Wire, tools, fence posts all going for scrap prices. Might be worth the drive if you're still patching that north stretch. I am. Figured. A pause. You going alone? I generally do. He hadn't argued. Nobody argued with her about going places alone anymore. They'd stopped trying somewhere around the 6-month mark of her widowhood. Once it became clear that Odessa Kane intended to keep driving her own wagon, mending her own fence, making her own decisions, with or without a man's name attached to any of it. So she went alone the way she always did. She had no earthly idea. Climbing up onto her wagon seat that morning with a thermos of coffee and a list of scrap prices scratched onto the back of an old envelope, that by sundown she would own 40 starving bison, owe a debt of gratitude to 2 men she hadn't planned on needing, and stand on the edge of a secret her husband had carried to his grave without ever once mentioning it. The gravel lot outside Salt Fork smelled like frost and rust and something dying slow. 40 bison stood crammed into the last holding pen, the one furthest from the road, the one nobody had bothered walking all the way out to. Ribs pressed up visible under dull, patchy coats. Heads hanging low. Breath coming out in thin gray ropes that curled once in the cold air and vanished before anyone standing nearby could feel sorry about it. Nobody standing nearby felt sorry about it. The auctioneer, a reedy, nervous man named Cobb Whitfield, hired for the day, and clearly wishing he weren't climbed up onto an overturned crate near the front of the crowd and cleared his throat twice. Most of the men gathered there didn't look up from their conversations, because everybody already understood what this particular lot represented. Dead weight. A problem somebody else would have to solve, and solve fast, since the receivers had given the whole property exactly 1 day to clear before the bank locked the gate for good and called the matter closed. Odessa stood near the back with a coil of used fencing wire slung over one shoulder, already paid for, already loaded onto her wagon. She wasn't there for Bison. She had no reason on this earth to be looking at that pen at all, except she looked anyway. And the longer she looked, the harder it got to look away. Because the herd had arranged itself strange, not scattered the way starved, frightened animals usually scatter pressed into corners, backs to the fence, eyes rolling white with fear of every sound. No, these had formed something closer to a ring, the weakest ones toward the center tucked in tight, the older cows facing outward, heads low but steady, planted like sentries, too exhausted to fall over and too stubborn to lie down either. One cow stood at the very front of that ring, barely holding herself upright. Legs trembling visibly under her own weight, sides heaving with the effort of simply remaining vertical. And still, she hadn't moved from that spot, like she'd elected herself the last wall standing between the herd behind her and whatever came next. Odessa had seen a stance like that before, on a man years ago, in a doorway, in pouring rain, refusing to step inside until she was safely through the door first. She didn't buy those animals out of pity. People in Red Hollow would say that for months afterward, and they would be wrong every single time, and she would let them stay wrong, because correcting an entire town's assumptions cost more energy than she had left to spare that season. She bought them because something low in her chest recognized the shape of that ring the instant she saw it. Recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting on a letter you don't remember writing. Whitfield started the bidding low, visibly hoping that anybody, would take the whole lot off the receiver's hands before he had to stand up here looking foolish in front of half the ranchers in the county. $800, he said, for the entire herd. Who'll hundred silence? He tried again. 800. Come, gentlemen, that's scrap pricing for 40 head of livestock. More silence. A few coughs. A man near the front actually laughed short, disbelieving at the idea that anyone would call these animals livestock at all. Odessa raised her paddle before she'd finished deciding to. Paddle number 47, held so high her arm had gone numb before she fully registered raising it at all. The room didn't go quiet the polite way rooms sometimes go quiet. It went quiet the specific way a room goes quiet when 40 people simultaneously decide someone has just made a fool of herself in public, and they are all far too delighted by the prospect to say so out loud just yet. A held breath, a held laugh, cocked and ready. Then somebody let the laugh go. One sharp bark from the front row. And that was all it took to open the floodgates. Barnaby Thorncroft didn't stand up. Didn't need to. A man who owned 11,000 acres of the county's best grassland had no need to rise from his chair to be heard in a room this size. He simply turned, slow, the particular slow turn of a man who already knows how a story ends and wants to watch your face while you find out. Whoever buys that lot, he announced, pitched loud enough to carry to every corner of the room, better set aside some of that money for a shovel. Bury 'em before the holidays, or the smell'll do the job for you. The laughter rolled bigger this time, fuller. The kind of laughter that comes easy to men who've never once had to wonder whether a room was laughing at them. Odessa didn't turn around. She knew that particular laugh well by now. Had absorbed variations of it for 2 years running, since Caleb died and left her 160 acres sitting square between two pieces of Thorncroft's growing empire, Like a splinter, he could not quite manage to work free no matter how he pressed at it. Whitfield rapped his gavel weakly against the crate, going once. Nobody else lifted the paddle, going twice. Because who would? 40 starving animals with no clean papers, no proof of bloodline, no guarantee even one of them would survive the drive home, let alone a hard winter on unprepared land. A gamble wearing the costume of livestock sold to the widow Kane, $800, and there it was. Hers. Whitfield lowered his gavel and muttered something to the clerk beside him. Not quite quiet enough, 40 walking corpses, and she paid good money for the privilege, and the nearest few rows caught it and laughed along with him, the sound rippling backward through the crowd, before Odessa had even fully lowered her arm. Whitfield climbed down off his crate and approached her, almost gentle about delivering the second half of the news, like a man softening bad medicine. You understand they've got to be off this property by noon tomorrow. Banks locking the gate at first light the day after. Odessa looked past him, out at the pen. At 40 enormous, starving animals that had become, in the space of about 30 seconds, entirely her problem, and entirely without anywhere to go. The purchase, it turned out, had been the easy part. She hadn't fully understood that until this exact moment, standing here with her arms still raised, going numb at the shoulder, her mind already sprinting ahead into arithmetic she didn't yet have numbers for. Around her, the crowd broke apart into small murmuring clusters. Fragments reached her anyway, the way they always did, whether she wanted them or not. Lost whatever sense her father left her poor Otis. Telling her about the scrap sale, he never figured Widow Kane. Would you look at the size of that purchase? Don't know what she thinks she let it wash over her. She'd had 2 years of practice letting things wash over her. Except this time it landed differently. Because this time it wasn't only her grief on trial, or her judgment, or her stubbornness about staying on land Thorncroft wanted badly enough to keep sweetening his offers. This time it was her body standing there in the cold, her hands gripping the paddle, the whole physical shape of her, weighed and dismissed in the same breath. It took someone to murmur Widow Kane. She'd heard that one before too. Plenty of times, said just barely behind a raised hand, sometimes not even that far behind it. Surprised her horse can pull that wagon at all. Odessa Kane was not, and had never been, a small woman. Broad through the shoulders, broad through everything, built the way the women on her mother's side had always been built, sturdy, weight-bearing, made to carry things, which was, as it happened, precisely what the coming year intended to ask of her, though standing there in that gravel lot she had no way yet of understanding how much. Thorncroft fell into step beside her as she started toward the pen, uninvited, the way men like him generally arrived at your side without asking permission first. You know, he said, conversational, the tone a man might use discussing weather. I've offered to buy that land of yours 3 times now. I know it, and you understand I'll get it eventually. One way or another. You said that last spring. I meant it last spring too. He glanced sideways at the pen, then back at her. By spring I'll own this herd and your land both. Won't cost me $800 either. Won't cost me anything at all, matter of fact. Just time. Time's cheap when a person's patient enough to spend it. She didn't answer. Kept walking. Boots crunching on frozen gravel, past men who wouldn't meet her eyes, and a very few, a small handful, who watched her with something closer to curiosity than scorn. The way you watch a house catch fire from a safe distance. Can't quite look away. Don't particularly want to help either. She let herself feel it. Just for one single step, that specific cold that settles into the chest right after a person has done something entirely irreversible. Then she kept walking, because standing still in that lot wasn't going to move 40 animals off it before noon tomorrow. Behind her, the herd shifted in the pen, 40 low voices, rough and uneasy in the cold air. Already Odessa was running numbers in her head. Hay against days remaining before the freeze. Fencing against dollars she didn't have. Distance against the shrinking hours of daylight. The arithmetic of survival. She had no idea yet how completely it would come to consume her. She didn't sleep that night. Sat instead at her kitchen table, one lamp burning low, a stack of paper scraps spread out in front of her, scratching lists in handwriting that got progressively worse the later the hour ran. Because owning 40 bison and being able to move. 40 bison turned out to be 2 entirely separate problems, and she had solved exactly none of either. No stock trailer built to hold animals that size. Her own fencing, strung years ago for a handful of horses and one aging milk cow, wasn't built to contain wild cattle that could put a shoulder through a rail without even noticing the resistance. Her hay stores would stretch 3 weeks if she rationed carefully. maybe less if the weather turned mean early. As if her savings already worn thin from 2 years of solar fence repair and hired out day labor, and a pride that had refused more than once to let her ask for help she badly needed, that account sat close to nothing now. $800 gone in one gravel lot afternoon. Outside the black kitchen window, past her own dim reflection, a storm system was building somewhere over the western mountains. Early. Too early for this point in the season. She'd overheard the men at the feed store using words like dangerous, unseasonable, words that made the hair on her arms rise even standing in her own warm kitchen. She needed help. Tonight, if she could manage it, before daylight took away whatever nerve she still had left to ask for it. But first, for just a moment, sitting alone in that lamplight, she let herself remember. Caleb used to sit at this exact table, same chair near enough, same lamp, though the wick had been replaced a dozen times since. He used to spread his own scraps of paper out across the wood grain when a hard season was coming, and he'd chew the end of his pencil, and he'd mutter numbers under his breath, like a man saying a rosary. She could still hear him doing it. 2 years gone, and she could still hear it plain, as if he'd only stepped out to check the horses and would be back any minute, now with cold hands and a complaint about the wind. Once early in their marriage, before either of them had learned yet how hard this land could push back, she'd asked him why he never seemed afraid of a bad season. Why the numbers never seemed to frighten him the way they frightened her. He'd looked up at her over the lamp, and he'd said, plain as anything, because fear doesn't fix fence, Des. Numbers do. You do the numbers scared or you do 'em calm, don't change the numbers any. Might as well do 'em calm. She'd married him for a great many reasons. That was one of the bigger ones. He'd never once in all their years together made her feel like her size was something to apologize for. Never once looked at her the way half of Red Hollow looked at her now, like a woman built the way she was built, had no earthly business owning land, running stock, standing up straight in a room full of men who thought otherwise. He used to say, when he caught her hunching her shoulders in church, trying to take up less space in a pew that had plenty of room to spare, he used to lean over and murmur, low enough that only she could hear it, sit up, Des. You're not in anybody's way. You never have been. She missed that. Missed it more than she missed almost anything else about him some days. Not the big things, the small ones. The permission, quiet and constant, to simply exist at the size she was, in the body she had, without shrinking herself down to fit somebody else's comfort. And now here she sat, 2 years on, doing his exact arithmetic at his exact table, and she found herself wondering, really wondering, for the first time in longer than she could say what else he might have been carrying, that he'd never once thought to set down on this table between them. He'd never mentioned Thorncroft, not once. Not even in passing, the flat dismissive way a man mentions someone he simply doesn't care for. She hadn't thought a thing of it, back when he was alive. A person doesn't go looking for the shape of an absence until something forces them to notice it's there. She pushed the thought aside. Not gone, just set down, the way you set down a tool you'll need again later, once your hands are free. Right now, she had 40 starving animals and less than 12 hours to move them. She thought of Amos first. Amos Reed's family had known Caleb's family 3 generations back. He owned an aging stock truck that had, over the years, hauled everything from mules to church pews to, once memorably, a piano nobody in town could quite explain the need for. Odessa hitched her own wagon in the dark and drove the 2 miles to his place with her lantern swinging wild against a rising wind, and she knocked on his door at an hour that would have been considered rude for absolutely anyone else in the county. He answered in his nightshirt, hair standing up on one side, and took one look at her face and didn't bother asking what was wrong. 2 trips, she said, before noon tomorrow. 2 trips where Salt Fork. Then here. He was quiet a beat longer than she liked. Long enough that she began, in the space of that silence, constructing her next plan. Who else? What else? Was there anyone else in this whole county? Who'd you buy something you shouldn't have, Odessa? I bought 40 bison for $800. Another silence, longer this time. Then, lo, half a laugh caught somewhere in his throat and, refusing to come all the way out, Lord. I know, you got money to pay me? No, then what've you got? She thought about that honestly. Thought about what remained to her, after everything, which wasn't much of anything, which came down mostly to this, the plain ability to keep a promise once she'd made one. I'll fix your north fence come spring. All of it. However long it takes me. Amos rubbed one hand down over his face. looked past her shoulder into the dark at the wind bending the grass sideways along the road. "Get the truck warmed up," he said finally. "I'll get my boots on, Doctor." Ezra Boone arrived at Salt Fork before the first truckload had even left the lot, which told Odessa two useful things about the man before he'd said a word to her directly. First, that Amos had gone and found him without being asked twice. Second, that Ezra Boone apparently did not, as a rule, sleep much either. He was lean, silver through the beard, moved like his knees had opinions his hands hadn't caught up to yet. Spent years in his younger days tending bison for a conservation outfit up near the territory line before slowing down and settling into general practice, mending whatever walked, limped, or got carried through his front door. He didn't say hello, climbed straight up onto the pen rail and started looking. Eyes, gait, gums. The particular glassy stillness in an animal's stare that signals real sickness as opposed to simple hunger, which looks entirely different to a trained eye even if it looks the same to everybody else. "They're starved," he said at last, not turning around. "Not diseased. There's a difference, and it matters more than you'd think. Because you cannot feed a starved animal the way you'd feed a merely hungry one. Flood a body like this with rich feed too fast. It'll kill faster than the starving would have on its own. I've watched it happen. Good intentions have buried more animals in this county than bad ones ever did." Odessa hadn't known any of that. Hadn't known the first thing about any of it. She wrote it down anyway, in the dark, by lantern light, in a small notebook she'd grabbed off the kitchen table, on her way out the door, without quite knowing why she'd grabbed it. "How do I feed them then?" "Slow. Small amounts, spaced out. I'll write you a schedule. And the fencing? Whatever you've got won't hold them if that's what you're asking, and I expect that's exactly what you're asking." He climbed down off the rail, joints protesting audibly. "You'll want the weak stretches reinforced before they're loose in your pasture, not after." Ezra moved through the herd slow after that, patient in the way that comes only from doing a thing so many times your hands stop needing your mind's explicit permission to keep working. "3 of these are in real danger," he said, marking each with a look and a small nod. "Nothing more elaborate than that. Watch them close the first week. Rest of the cows most can likely still breed, near as I can tell without better tools than the 2 eyes I brought with me tonight. No sign of anything catching. No sign of the kind of sickness that'd make this whole business a public health matter, whatever Thorncroft decides to tell the county paper by morning." "You think he'll say something?" "I think," Ezra said, still not looking up from the animal in front of him, "a man like Thorncroft says something about everything, whether anyone's asked him to or not." He kept working through the herd by lantern light, and Odessa Otch watched him, and noticed, though she didn't have words for it yet, wouldn't have words for it for weeks, the particular way several of these animals moved, not scattered wild, disciplined, as if something buried deep in their bodies still remembered being managed once, cared for once, a long time ago, by people who had understood exactly what they were doing with a herd this size. She filed the observation away without knowing why. Just filed it the way you file away a smell that reminds you of somewhere you can't quite place. Loading them onto Amos's truck took the better part of the remaining night, and it was nothing like loading cattle. Cattle followed a rope, mostly. Followed each other, followed habit. These animals followed nothing, followed no one, except, strangely, the old cow at the front of the ring. Amos built a makeshift chute out of salvaged panels, while Ezra worked the herd from behind, slow, patient. No shouting, no prodding, nothing that might spook 39 already terrified animals into a stampede that could kill somebody in the dark. Odessa found her own place at the gate, holding a lantern high, and watched the strangest thing she'd seen all night. The old cow moved first, walked calm into the chute like she'd already decided it was safe, and the herd, every single one of them, followed her in without argument. "Would you look at that?" Amos said, low, wiping sweat off his forehead despite the cold. "Never seen a herd this jumpy follow a lead that easy." "She's not just jumpy scared," Ezra said, watching close. "She's trained calm. Different thing entirely. A wild scattered animal follows nobody. A trained animal follows whoever it trusts to lead it somewhere safe." He glanced at Odessa. "Somebody taught that cow to trust a chute, once." Long before tonight, Odessa said nothing, just held the lantern steady and watched 39 starving, exhausted animals file calmly into a truck bed behind one old cow who seemed to understand, better than any human standing in that lot, exactly what was being asked of her. By the time the first truckload pulled out onto the county road, False dawn was already graying the eastern sky, and Odessa's arms ached from holding the lantern steady for 3 straight hours. She didn't complain, didn't have the breath to spare for complaining, not with the second truckload still waiting and noon bearing down faster than she liked. The trucks rolled through Red Hollow just after sunrise, and word traveled faster than the wheels did. People lined the road on both sides. By the time the second truckload passed the general store, a small crowd of 6 or 7 had gathered, pretending to be about their own business, while watching the strange procession of gaunt, enormous animals rolling past on flatbeds like something escaped from a traveling sideshow. Somebody laughed. Somebody always laughed. Poor woman. Odessa heard, not nearly quiet enough, a woman standing outside the dry goods store with a basket balanced on one arm. All alone out there, and now this on top of everything. Heard she paid $800. For that, Lord have mercy on her. Odessa kept her eyes fixed forward, kept her hands steady on the reins even though nothing inside her chest felt remotely steady that morning. Because here was the thing none of them standing on that boardwalk understood, and she had no intention of stopping to explain it to a single one of them. They believed this was about grief, about a widow so lost in her own private sorrow that she'd finally lost her judgment right along with it. They were wrong. She hadn't been grieving in that pen last night. She'd been working. First real work she'd done in 2 years that made her feel like something more substantial than a name. On a deed men kept trying to pry loose from her, one offer at a time. That afternoon, Thorncroft gave a statement to the county paper. Odessa heard about it before she read it, which somehow made it worse. Since by the time the actual print words reached her, they'd already passed through 4 separate mouths and picked up sharper edges with every retelling. When she finally sat down and read it herself, the ink still faintly smelling of the press, it wasn't quite as bad as she'd braced herself for. It was worse in a different, quieter way. He hadn't called her foolish, hadn't called her fat, hadn't called her desperate, hadn't said any of the things already circulating on porches and store aisles all over town. He'd been smarter than that, far smarter. He'd expressed concern, wondered aloud, for the public record, whether a woman managing a small operation entirely on her own possessed the resources, he used that specific word, resources to properly care for animals of that size and temperament. Suggested gently, almost neighborly about it, that the county might want to look into the matter. Purely for everyone's safety, of course. Odessa read it through twice, set the paper down flat on the table, and thought, that's not concern. That's a plan. Wearing Concern's coat because Concern's coat happens to fit better in print. She went into town 2 days later for supplies, because the herd didn't care what the newspapers said, and neither, she reminded herself firmly, did she. Or she tried to remind herself of that. Tried and mostly managed it, right up until she stepped through the door of the dry goods store and ran straight into Della Ashworth, who had never in her life let a piece of gossip pass by unclaimed. Odessa Kane. Della said her name like a headline. I heard you were out there half the night in the cold, over one of those animals. News travels, well it does when Amos Reed tells his wife and his wife tells the whole choir. Della's eyes moved over her, quick assessing. The same look Odessa had felt 1,000 times before and had never once gotten fully used to. You look tired, dear. You want to be careful, at your size, pushing yourself that hard in this cold. Man your age well. Man your build, could take a real toll. Odessa let the sentence sit there a second before she answered it. I'm 43, Della, not 80. I only meant know what you meant. Ping pong, quick, no wasted words. Della's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Well, I only want what's best for you. Everyone does. Everyone. Odessa picked up her order off the counter. Funny how what's best for me always seems to look exactly like me giving up and going quiet. She left before Della could construct a response to that. Walked out into the cold with her jaw tight and her pulse still running a little too fast. And told herself, the way she'd been telling herself for 2 years now, that it didn't matter, that none of it mattered. Except it did. That was the thing nobody in this town seemed to understand about her, or maybe understood perfectly well and simply didn't care. Every comment about her size, her aloneness, her supposed foolishness, every one of them landed somewhere, built up, sat in her chest like sediment at the bottom of a still pond, and one day, she suspected, if enough of it piled up, it would finally choke the whole thing dead. Not today, though. Today she had feed to haul and fence to mend, and 39 more animals, depending on her showing up steady, whatever anybody in that store thought about the size of the woman doing the showing up. She loaded her wagon and drove home without looking back at the storefront once. The first real crisis came at night because apparently the universe had decided one disaster per day was an insufficient ration. One of the weakest cows went down in the north pasture just past 10 o'clock, couldn't get back up. Odessa found her by lantern light, sides heaving, legs splayed uselessly across the frozen grass, and something inside, her chest, simply dropped straight through the floor. She ran back to the house, grabbed the notebook off the kitchen table, the one where she'd scratched down every word Ezra had told her that first frantic night at Salt Fork, half by lantern light, half by memory afterward, flipped through with shaking hands, hunting for anything about an animal down and unable to rise, because he wasn't here. Couldn't be here. His hip wouldn't survive a wagon ride in this cold. He'd told her as much weeks back, plain, no apology in it, which meant whatever came, manage it with nothing but her own two hands, and whatever she'd thought to write down in the dark. Windbreak. That much she remembered clear, underlined twice in her own hurried hand. Get a windbreak up first, before anything else. Before the rubbing, before the talking, before any of it, she did that first. Hauled spare fence panels across a frozen field in the pitch dark, hands screaming inside thin gloves, breath tearing out of her in ragged white clouds, and rigged together something that might generously be called a windbreak if a person squinted hard and declined to examine it too closely. Then back to the notebook, checking the next line by lantern light. Then back to the cow. Then back to the notebook again, over and over for hours, the whole cycle reading itself, while the temperature kept dropping and her own fear kept climbing right alongside it. Ezra's voice stayed steady in her memory the entire time, the way he'd said it that first night at Salt Fork, walking her through each next step as best she could recall the words. Keep her chest elevated if you're able. Don't force her onto her feet, you'll only hurt her worse. Rub her legs, get the blood moving through them. Talk to her, doesn't much matter what you say. They listen to the sound of a voice more than they listen to the actual words. So she talked, knelt in the frozen grass beside a dying animal at midnight, inside a windbreak she'd built with her own two bare hands out of parts and pure stubbornness, and she talked. Low, steady, unhurried, even though everything in her wanted to hurry. And without meaning to, without deciding to, without any warning at all, she borrowed her husband's voice, because that was exactly how Caleb used to talk to sick animals in this same pasture years back. Low and even, like patience by itself, could hold a failing body together clear through until sunrise. The wind'll ease, she told the cow, voice rough with cold and exhaustion. Grass'll come back, thick come spring. You'll see it yourself. Promises she had no earthly right to make. She made them anyway, because what else was there to say? Kneeling in frozen grass at midnight with nobody watching, and nothing left to lose by sounding foolish where no living soul could overhear her. Her hands went entirely numb somewhere around 1 a.m. She kept working anyway. Kept rubbing circless lips back into legs that showed no interest in cooperating. Kept talking low and rough, in a voice that wasn't quite her own and wasn't quite not. And just before dawn, right as the sky began going that pale, uncertain gray, that means morning is coming whether a body feels ready for it or not. The cow shifted, pushed one trembling leg underneath herself, then another. Odessa stopped breathing entirely. The cow swayed hard, nearly went down again, caught herself at the very last instant, stood, unsteady, shaking through every visible muscle, upright. Odessa sat back hard on her heels in the frozen grass and felt something in her chest come loose that had been wound tight for far longer than she cared to admit. 2 years tight, if she was being fully honest with herself. Maybe longer than that, if she went back far enough. Hope, she said out loud, to nobody in particular, to the animal, to the empty pasture and the slowly paling sky above it. That's what I'll call you. Hope. She allowed herself precisely one moment resembling celebration. Then she remembered 39 more animals remained out there in that same brutal cold, and winter had only just begun showing its teeth, and the moment passed the way most good moments seemed to pass that entire year. Quick, quiet, gone before she could get a proper hold on it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, if you could call it that. Rough, unforgiving, but a rhythm all the same, up before light. Check the water first, because water froze fastest and killed quickest if you let it go too long. Then feed, rationed the way Ezra had taught her, small amounts spaced through the day instead of one large dump that might do more harm than the starving itself had done. Then fence, always fence. Some stretch of it always needed mending, Some rail always needed reinforcing, some post always needed resetting after 39 restless animals had leaned on it overnight, testing its patience. Her hands roughened, cracked at the knuckles from the cold and the wire both. She stopped noticing mostly, except at night, when the ache settled in deep enough to keep her from sleeping, even after a day that should have exhausted her past caring. She lost weight some, though not in the way anybody in Red Hollow would have predicted or approved of. Not the kind of weight loss folks like to comment on with false, syrupy concern. Just the lean, practical burning off of a body working harder than it had worked in years, fueled by less food than it needed, because there was never quite enough hours in a day to cook a proper meal after everything else got done. She caught her reflection once in the dark kitchen window and didn't recognize the woman looking back right away. Not because she looked smaller. She didn't, not really, not yet, but because she looked awake. Alert in a way she hadn't looked in 2 years, like something in her had stopped merely enduring each day and started instead actually living inside it. Hope grew stronger fastest of all of them, which surprised nobody more than Odessa herself. Within a week the cow was following her along the fence line most mornings. Not close, not tame exactly, but present. Watching. The way you watch someone you've decided, for reasons entirely your own, to trust. Odessa took to talking to her during the morning feeding. Not the desperate midnight promises from that first terrible night. Just ordinary talk. The kind you'd offer any quiet companion who couldn't answer back but seemed, somehow, to be listening all the same. Your friends still don't much like me, she told Hope one gray morning, nodding toward the rest of the herd, still keeping their distance near the tree line. Can't say I blame them. Wouldn't trust a stranger with my whole life either, if I were in their position. Hope chewed steadily, watched her with an eye that gave away nothing and somehow at the same time gave away everything. You'll come around, Odessa said, or you won't. Either way, I'll keep showing up. Seems to be the only thing I'm good for lately. She said it light, almost joking, the way she'd learned to say hard, true things so they'd slide past easier. But some part of her meant it plainly. Showing up. That was the whole of what she had left to offer anybody, herself included. Not answers, not certainty, not the $90,000 sitting untouched in Thorncroft's back pocket. Just the willingness to keep arriving, morning after morning, whatever the previous night had cost her. 3 of the weak ones stayed weak longer than Ezra liked, and he came out twice more that first fortnight to check them, frowning over each one with the particular focus of a man who took every loss personally, whether or not it was strictly his to take. One of the 3 didn't make it. An old bull, already failing badly the night of the auction, gone quiet in the north corner one morning before Odessa had even finished her first round of the fence. She buried what she could of him herself, ground too frozen for a proper grave, and settled for covering him as best she could and marking the spot, and stood there a long moment afterward with her breath fogging in the cold, feeling the loss the way you feel any loss that arrives after you've already started hoping too hard against it. One, she said out loud, to nobody, to the frozen ground, to the gray morning sky. Only one. Could have been worse. It could have been. She knew that. Knew it clearly, the practical arithmetic part of her mind already recalculating the numbers to account for 39 animals instead of 40. It didn't make standing over that frozen ground feel any less like failing him, all the same. She went back to work anyway. Because that was the only response this year seemed to accept from her. Not grief dwelled on, not anger indulged. Just work. The next fence rail, the next ration of feed, the next morning, arriving whether she felt ready for it or not. Morning delivered the next blow, because the universe had apparently revised its policy upward once again, to 2 disasters a day and climbing. The feed supplier arrived himself just after breakfast, wagon still hitched, hat already in his hands before he'd fully climbed down. Odessa recognized the apologetic set of his shoulders before he'd said a single word, that particular posture a man carries right before delivering news nobody on the receiving end wants to hear. I'm real sorry, Mrs. Kane. I'm going to have to cancel your order. You confirmed it Tuesday. I know I did, ma'am, but the entire available supply of quality hay in this whole region got bought up. All of it. Yesterday afternoon, near as I can figure. Her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with the weather outside. Bought up by who? A pause. Long enough on its own to answer the question before he ever said it aloud. Blackthorn range and beef. He didn't linger after that. Couldn't quite meet her eyes climbing back up onto his wagon seat. Odessa stood in her own dooryard and watched him go, then turned back toward the kitchen and sat herself down at the table, staring hard at the wood grain in front of her like it might rearrange itself into some kind of solution if she looked at it long enough and hard enough. Because here was the plain fact of the matter. She couldn't sue him over it, couldn't report him to anybody who'd care to listen, couldn't do one single thing about it through any proper channel, because Thorncroft hadn't broken a single law in doing it. He had simply outbid every other buyer in the county for a resource she desperately needed, using money she plainly did not have and never would have enough of to compete with him fairly. A perfectly legal way to strangle a smaller operation, without ever once laying an actual hand on it. She sat with that fact a long while. Let the anger rise up and burn through her chest for exactly as long as she needed it to. Then, because sitting with anger, however satisfying, does not put one single mouthful of feed in front of 40 starving animals, she made herself set it down and start thinking instead. If she couldn't buy hay, she would find something else to feed them. She spent that whole afternoon walking her own land with fresh eyes, really looking at it for what felt like the first time in months. Not as failing pasture. Not as a problem Thorncroft wanted solved by simply buying her out of it, but as 40 acres of native grass and scrub brush that a properly managed bison herd might actually make good use of, if she was clever enough about how she moved them through it. She remembered, half remembered, the memory rusty from disuse a rotational grazing method from an agricultural course she'd started years back and never once finished. Small sections. Move the herd along before any single patch got grazed down to bare dirt. Let each section rest and recover behind them while they worked the next. She started marking off sections with what fencing wire she had left. The very same wire, as it happened, that she had originally driven to Salt Fork intending to buy, before 40 starving animals had rearranged every single plan she'd walked in there, carrying. Neighbors driving past on the county roads slowed their wagons to watch. Nobody stopped to lend a hand. A few simply shook their heads, that particular slow headshake that means, without a single word spoken, well, she'll learn soon enough. Odessa kept working anyway. That evening she sat again with her notebook and did the arithmetic Caleb had taught her never to fear, no matter how ugly the numbers turned out to be. Mineral supplements. $12 if she bought the cheaper grade and rationed it careful. Hay, what little decent hay remained anywhere in the county that Thorncroft hadn't already bought up, first call it $30 more, for a supply that wouldn't stretch nearly far enough. Wire. Posts. A new latch for the north gate, since the old one had finally given up entirely under the weight of 39 bison, learning exactly how much pressure it could withstand before failing. She added the column. Added it again, hoping the second sum might come out kinder than the first. It didn't. What remained in her account, after all of it, was thin enough that a bad week, one sick animal, one broken act, one unexpected bill from the county would empty it completely. She sat with that fact a long moment, the way she'd learned to sit with hard facts these past 2 years, without flinching, without pretending they were softer than they actually were. Because fear doesn't fix fence. Numbers do. She could hear Caleb saying it, plain as anything, and for once the memory didn't ache quite so sharp. It steadied her instead, gave her something solid to stand on while the actual ground kept shifting underneath everything else. She wrote out a shopping list for the following morning. Mineral block. Rationed hay. Latch. Hardware. Nothing extra. Nothing for herself. She'd Nassim coat 3 winters running, and saw no reason that streak needed breaking now, not with 39 animals needing every spare dollar more urgently than she needed a new coat. She closed the notebook, pinched out the lamp, and lay awake a while longer in the dark, listening to the wind test the shutters, running the numbers one more time in her head just to be certain she hadn't missed anything. She hadn't. That was the trouble. She'd counted correctly the first time. The numbers were simply that tight, and there was nothing left to do about it except keep working and hope the winter went easier than the forecasters kept insisting it would. Ezra came back out to check the herd the following week, unasked, the same way he seemed to do most things. He moved through the animals slower this time, less urgent than that first frantic night, and Odessa walked beside him with her notebook out, writing down whatever he said without waiting to be told to write it down. Coats are already looking better, he said. Not by much, but better. Hope's eating well. Hope's a fighter. I could see that in her the first night, the way she wouldn't stay down even when her body wanted her to. He glanced sideways at Odessa. Some creatures are like that. Refuse to lie down and be finished even when everything about the situation says they should. She didn't answer that directly. Wasn't sure if he meant the cow or something else entirely, and didn't want to ask and find out she was wrong. You've done this kind of work before, she'd said instead. The conservation herds up north. Years of it. What made you stop? He was quiet a moment, checking a hoof, setting it back down gentle. Same thing that makes most men stop most things. Money ran out. Backers pulled away. Whole operation folded up inside of a season, and the herd got scattered to whoever'd take them. He straightened, slow, hand pressed to the small of his back. Happens more than folks realize. Good herds, careful breeding, generations of work gone. Just like that. Soon as the money loses interest. Odessa filed that away too, the way she'd been filing things away all week without quite knowing why. A drawer in her mind steadily filling up with pieces that didn't fit together yet. They were still out at the pen when a rider came slow along the county road, didn't turn in, didn't wave, just slowed his horse enough to really look at the fence lines, the pasture divisions, the herd itself, before nudging the animal back up to pace and continuing on. "Who's that?" Odessa asked low. Ezra didn't turn his head, but his voice dropped a shade. "Judd Slate, Thorncroft's operations man. Doesn't come out this way for his health. He's scouting. Looks that way to me." "Scouting what, exactly?" "There's nothing here worth." She stopped herself, because there was something here worth looking at. Wasn't there? There was a fence line she'd rebuilt with borrowed help. There was a herd that was against every prediction made in that auction room, still standing. And there was, somewhere under thick winter hair on at least one of these animals, an old iron brand shaped like a crown that she hadn't told a living soul about yet, not even Ezra. "Worth what?" Ezra prompted, watching her face. "Nothing," she said, just thinking out loud. He didn't push. But he watched the rider's dust settle on the road a moment longer than the question strictly required, and Odessa got the distinct sense that Ezra noticed a great deal more than he generally said out loud. 3 days later, Thorncroft sent word inviting her to his office. She nearly didn't go. Sat with the folded note in her hand for the better part of an hour, turning it over and over, trying to guess in advance what fresh pressure was arriving, wrapped in such careful, polite paper. In the end she went, because refusing felt like handing him a small victory for free, and she was not currently in the business of handing this particular man anything at all, free or otherwise. His office was paneled in dark wood that made her entire kitchen back home look like a garden shed by comparison. Leather chairs. A rifle mounted above the fireplace that had probably never fired a shot in anger in its whole life, just hung there for effect, the way everything in this room seemed to hang there for effect. He didn't stand when she entered. Simply gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and she took it, and she waited him out, hands folded in her lap, spine straight the way Caleb had always told her to hold it. "Coffee," he offered, already reaching for the pot on the side table without waiting for an answer. No. He poured himself a cup anyway. Took his time about it. Let the silence stretch the way men like him always seemed to think silence was a tool that only worked in their favor. It wasn't. Odessa had gotten very good over 2 years at sitting inside silence without flinching. "How's the herd?" he said finally, settling back into his chair. "Standing. That surprises me." "Doesn't surprise me at all." A small smile there and gone. "You always were stubborn. Caleb used to say that about you. Said it was the thing he liked best and the thing that scared him most. Both at once." Her chest tightened at hearing her husband's name in this room, out of this man's mouth, so casually, like he had any right to it at all. "You didn't invite me here to talk about Caleb." "No," he agreed. "I invited you here to talk business." $90,000, he said then. No further preamble. "For the land. Enough to clear whatever debt you're carrying at the bank and leave you 6 months in the house besides, while you sort out where you're headed next. The land's worth considerably more than that. The land is worth exactly what somebody's willing to pay for it, Mrs. Kane. And at present, I happen to be the only somebody making an offer at all." She didn't answer right away. Let the silence stretch out uncomfortable between them until he finally shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him. "You've already proven you've got nerve," he said. Gentler now, almost persuasive about it. "Buying that herd outright. Standing your ground in that auction room in front of the whole county. Nobody doubts for a moment that you've got nerve, Mrs. Kane. Now, you need to prove you're smart enough to recognize when the time's come to fold your hand." "I'm not folding." Something flickered briefly across his face, not quite anger. More like recalculation, a man silently adjusting a plan that had just run headlong into an obstacle he hadn't fully accounted for going in. "Why not?" he asked, and for a moment the smoothness slipped just slightly, real curiosity showing through underneath it. Truly, why not take it? You'd be free of debt, free of that failing land, free of 40 animals that half this county still expects to be dead by Christmas. Because it's mine. It's 160 acres of scrub and sorrow, Mrs. Kane. I could name you 6 better parcels within a day's ride. None of them are mine. He studied her a long moment, like he was recalculating something on the far side of his own face. You're not doing this for the land. You could sell the land and buy better land cheaper, easier. So it's not the dirt you're holding on to. Maybe not. Then what? She thought about it honestly, sitting there in his ridiculous paneled office, and found the true answer before she'd fully meant to say it out loud. This town decided 2 years ago what I was, she said. Widow Kane. Poor thing. Too big, too alone, too foolish to know when to quit. I could sell you this land tomorrow and move to the next county over, and you know what I'd be there? Exactly the same thing. Because it was never about the dirt, Mr. Thorncroft. It's about who gets to decide what I'm capable of, and I'm done letting that be anybody but me. For once, he didn't have a quick answer ready. Your loan comes up for review this spring, he said instead, recovering, falling back on the one lever he still had left to pull. I know several people at that bank personally. I'm aware you do. Doesn't that concern you at all? Everything concerns me, Mr. Thorncroft. Doesn't mean I sign whatever you happen to set down in front of me. She rose to leave, and it was here, right here, at the door, hand already resting on the frame, back half turned toward him, that he said the thing that would sit, lodged in her chest for weeks afterward, turning itself over and over, refusing to make sense until, eventually, all at once, it finally did. You know, he said, quieter now, almost to himself, like the words had slipped out before he'd fully decided to release them. Your husband and I had business together once, long before you ever came into it. She stopped cold, turned back halfway. What kind of business? Something shut across his face. A door closing, fast the way a man slams a door the instant he realizes he's said one word more than he'd ever meant to let out. Ancient history, he said. Doesn't matter now, one way or the other. It matters to me. Go on home, Mrs. Kane. Go feed your dying herd. We'll speak again come spring, once you've had time to think it through properly. She left without another word, because there was clearly nothing further to be gotten from him that day. That much was plain in the set of his jaw. But she carried the sentence home with her regardless, turning it over the entire drive back in the fading light, and it settled into her chest like a stone whose exact shape she couldn't quite place. Your husband and I had business once. 2 full years married to Caleb Kane, and not once, not one single time, in all that time had he ever mentioned Barnaby Thorncroft's name to her. Not in passing conversation, not in anger, not even in the flat, dismissive way a person mentions someone they simply don't much care for. Silence of that particular kind isn't nothing. Silence like that is a door somebody built on purpose and then sealed shut and meant to stay sealed. She stopped at Amos's place on the way home, told herself it was to thank him again for the trucking, for the fence promise she still owed him, but really it was because she needed to say the sentence out loud to somebody who'd known Caleb and see what crossed their face when she did. Amos was mending a harness on his porch when she pulled up. Looked at her once, set the harness down. You look like you've seen a ghost. Thorncroft said he had business with Caleb once, before me. Amos went very still. What kind of business, she asked, echoing her own question from the office, watching Amos's face the same careful way she'd watched Thorncroft's. Couldn't say, because I don't know. Caleb wasn't a man who talked much about his own dealings. You know that better than anybody. He picked the harness back up, set it back down again, hands not quite settling. There was a stretch, though, year or 2 before he met you. He went quiet for a spell, wouldn't say why. Came back from somewhere up north different than he left. Harder, maybe. Careful about certain things he hadn't been careful about before. Up north where? Territory line, I believe. Never said exactly. He looked at her steady now. You think that's tied to Thorncroft? I don't know what to think. I just know the man let something slip he didn't mean to let slip, and then near about broke his own hand slamming the door shut on it. Amos was quiet a while, working a knot loose in the leather that didn't strictly need working. Whatever it is, he said finally, Caleb carried it a long time without telling a soul. Man like that doesn't do that for nothing. Might be worth asking yourself whether digging it up serves you, or just serves your curiosity. Might be both. Might be. He allowed himself half a smile. You were always going to dig regardless. I've known you 2 years, Odessa Kane. Man could build a house on how stubborn you are. She managed something close to a laugh at that, first one in days. Caleb used to say the same thing. Caleb was right about most things. Not about staying quiet, apparently. Amos didn't have an answer for that one. Neither did she. They sat with it a while on his porch in the cold, saying nothing more, and eventually she thanked him again for the fence favor still owed, and the conversation neither of them had wanted, and drove on home in the fading light with more questions rattling in her chest than she'd arrived with. She arrived home to find 3 of the bison had pushed straight through a weak stretch of her fence. Her heart lurched hard in her chest, pictured them, scattered loose across the county road, pictured the sheriff arriving at her gate with bad news, pictured every single thing falling apart in one single afternoon on top of everything already threatening to fall apart around her. Except they hadn't scattered anywhere at all. They had climbed the low ridge behind her property and gone to work, pawing carefully through the thin crust of early snow, clearing patches down to the grass buried underneath. Not randomly, deliberately, working their heads in slow, careful, circular sweeps, opening buried grass for the rest of the herd, trailing patiently behind them. Odessa stood at the broken fence line and simply watched, and something about the pattern snagged hard at her attention. Because this wasn't the kind of thing any ordinary wild animal simply happens to know how to do. This was learned behavior, something passed down, herd to herd, generation to generation, from animals that had once, long ago, been managed carefully by people who fully understood what they were doing. She thought back to Ezra's words in the dark that very first night. Several of these animals move like something in their bodies still remembers being managed once. She thought of the tight ring they'd formed back in that pen at Salt Fork, the old cow standing sentry at the very front of it, refusing to fall. She thought of a man sitting in a dark paneled office, saying your husband and I had business once, and then slamming that door shut on the rest of the sentence so fast he'd nearly caught his own fingers in it. Odessa walked the fence line the remainder of that evening, checking each animal as it passed her by, running her bare hand along matted, dull winter coats, looking now, the particular way a person looks once they've started suspecting something is being deliberately hidden from them. And on one of the older cows, half buried beneath thick winter hair, she finally found it. A brand, faint, old, scarred over through so many winters it had very nearly vanished into the hide completely. The shape of a crown, 3 distinct points. Made under the pads of her fingers, from something that felt less like simple paint and more like old, cold iron. She stood there a long while in the falling dark, one palm resting flat against that animal's shoulder, her breath fogging out slow in front of her, the first fine snow of the evening starting to drift down soft over the ridge behind her house. She had no idea yet what the mark actually meant, had no idea yet how deep her husband's silence truly ran, or precisely what Thorncroft had been hiding behind that door he'd shut so fast in his own office, on his own words, in front of his own desk. She only knew, standing there with her palm pressed flat against that old scarred brand, that the $800 she'd spent on a whim at a gravel lot auction had bought her a great deal more than 40 starving animals, and that whatever it actually was, Barnaby Thorncroft had already known it. Had known it, she was now certain, from the very first laugh he'd let loose in that auction room. Behind her, the herd settled slowly into the coming dark, 40 low voices rough against the rising wind, and somewhere among them, Hope stood steady on her own 4 legs, for the first time since that terrible first night, steady, unhurried, facing straight into the weather, like she had nothing left in this world to fear from it. Odessa pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and started back toward the house. There was a great deal of work still ahead of her. She understood that plainly enough by now. And now, for the first time since the gavel had come down on that gravel lot, she understood something else besides. She wasn't only fighting to keep 40 starving animals alive through one hard winter. She was standing directly on top of a secret her husband had carried into his grave without ever once speaking it aloud, and Barnaby Thorncroft clearly intended to make certain it stayed buried there right along with him. Odessa Kane intended otherwise. She turned that thought over once, twice, in her mind, and found she was not afraid of it. Whatever her husband had never told her, whatever Thorncroft had spent 2 years quietly maneuvering to keep hidden, whatever the shape of that iron crown actually meant, out here on this frozen ridge, under this thin new snow, she would find out. One way, she thought, walking the last stretch back toward her own lit kitchen window, or another. Behind her, the wind picked up, and the herd pressed closer together against it, and somewhere out past the ridge, the storm the forecasters had warned of kept building itself slowly over the mountains. Patient, unhurried, exactly the way trouble in that country always seemed to arrive. Not all at once, just closer and closer, until it wasn't approaching anymore, until it had simply quietly arrived. Inside the house later, with the fire banked low and her boots drying by the hearth, Odessa sat again at Caleb's table. Same chair, same lamp, same handwriting, still getting worse the later the hour ran. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, in careful letters, because writing something down was the only way she knew to make it feel real, instead of just frightening. Crown brand. Iron, at least 1 cow, likely more once I checked closer. Caleb business with T before me. Up north territory line. Came back changed. She stared at the page a long while because none of it made sense yet. Not really, just fragments. A mark on an old cow's hide. A sentence a man hadn't meant to say out loud. A silence her husband had kept so carefully, so completely, that in 2 years of marriage she'd never once suspected it existed. Except she was starting to understand that the silence itself was the shape of the answer, not the words Caleb hadn't said. The fact that he'd gone to such lengths not to say them. A man doesn't build a door that careful over nothing. She closed the notebook, pressed her palm flat against the cover, the way she'd pressed her palm flat against that old iron brand out on the ridge, like touch alone might coax something loose that words couldn't. Outside the wind picked up harder, rattling the shutters, and somewhere out past the dark glass she could hear the herd, settled now, low and steady 40 voices breathing together against the cold. She thought about the ring they'd formed in that pen at Salt Fork, about the old cow standing sentry at the front of it, refusing to fall even when every part of her body must have been screaming to. She thought about herself, sitting in this kitchen 2 years running, absorbing every murmured comment, every sideways glance, every carefully worded piece of concern that was really just a plan wearing a kinder coat, absorbing it and telling herself it didn't matter, that none of it mattered, right up until tonight, when she'd finally said the true thing out loud, in Thorncroft's own office, and watched it land somewhere he hadn't been braced for. It was never about the dirt. It's about who gets to decide what I'm capable of. She hadn't planned to say that. It had simply been sitting there, fully formed, waiting for the right moment to come out of her, the way the crown-shaped brand had been sitting there under matted hair, waiting for the right hand to find it. Maybe that was what this whole strange, impossible year was turning out to be. Not a rescue, not charity, whatever the town wanted to call it behind cupped hands. A slow, cold, difficult uncovering of a bloodline nobody else had bothered to look closely enough to see, and of a woman nobody else had bothered to look closely enough to see either. 2 things buried under matted hair and 2 years of careful silence, waiting on the same frozen ground for somebody stubborn enough to keep digging. She banked the fire lower, blew out the lamp, sat a moment longer in the dark, listening to the wind, to the herd, to the old house, settling around her the way it had settled every winter, for longer than she'd been alive in it. Tomorrow there would be feed to ration and fence to check, and 39 more animals depending on her showing up steady, regardless of what anyone in Red Hollow thought about the size or shape or aloneness of the woman doing the showing up. Tomorrow there would be Thorncroft, patient as a stone, waiting for spring the way he'd said he would. Tomorrow there would be a crown-shaped brand, still waiting for an explanation, and a husband's silence still waiting to be understood, and a whole hard winter still standing between her and any of the answers she was now determined to find. But tonight, for just a little while longer, there was only this: the dark, the wind, the low, steady 40 animals breathing together against the cold, alive, against every prediction made in that gravel lot 3 weeks back. Alive, because she had refused to let them be anything else. Odessa Kane sat in her dead husband's kitchen, in the house he'd left her, on the land Thorncroft wanted so badly he'd offered $90,000, and the ruin of her credit both to get it, and she made herself a second promise that night, sweeter than the first one, the one she'd whispered to a dying cow in a windbreak of spare fence panels. Whatever Caleb had buried, whatever Thorncroft was still trying to bury, whatever that old iron crown actually meant, out there under the snow, waiting, she would not stop until she dug every last piece of it into the light. Outside, the storm kept building over the mountains, patient, unhurried, exactly the way trouble in that country always seemed to arrive, and 40 animals slept on, steady, through the first real cold of the season, not knowing yet how much more winter still lay ahead of them. Not knowing yet that the woman standing between them and the worst of it had absolutely no intention of stepping aside. The storm came 3 days after her visit to Thorncroft's office, and it came early, and it came mean. Odessa woke to a sound she didn't recognize at first. Not wind exactly. Something under the wind, a low continuous roar, like the sky itself had decided to lean its whole weight against her house and see if the house pushed back. It didn't. Not much. The shutters rattled so hard one tore loose entirely and went cartwheeling off into the dark, and Odessa stood at the window in her nightdress, watching snow come sideways, not down. Sideways, thick as flour flung from a sack. Because the herd was out there. Because the north fence, the stretch she and Amos had reinforced. The stretch, she'd told herself, foolishly, was finally solid, had a section still weak near the old gate. She'd meant to fix it. Meant to next week once the mineral order came in. Next week wasn't going to help her tonight. She dressed in the dark. 2 shirts. Caleb's old coat over her own because his was heavier, and she'd stopped pretending pride mattered more than staying alive out there. Gloves, a lantern that the wind would likely kill inside of 10 minutes, and she went out into it anyway. The cold hit like a wall, like something solid enough to lean on if she'd wanted to, except leaning wasn't an option. Not with visibility down to nothing and the fence line somewhere out past a wall of driving white she couldn't see through. She went by memory, counted her own steps. 20 to the gate post, 40 to the bend, 60 to the weak stretch, and she found it exactly where memory said it would be. Wire already sagging, one post already leaning at an angle, meant it had maybe an hour left in it before the wind finished the job entirely. She worked with her back to the wind because facing it stole the breath clean out of her chest. Drove the post deeper with a mallet she could barely feel in her own hand. Strung new wire with fingers that had stopped some time back, reporting sensation of any kind. Until the wire slipped. Until it whipped loose and caught her across the cheek. A thin burning line of pain that she registered, distantly, as blood freezing almost as fast as it welled. She didn't stop, because stopping meant the fence stayed weak. And a weak fence meant 39 animals loose in a blizzard, scattered across open country in whiteout conditions, and she was not going to lose a single one more of them. Not tonight. Not to weather. Not after everything already spent to keep them standing. So she kept working. Post wire. Post wire. Her whole world narrowed down to the small circle her failing lantern still lit, 4 feet across, maybe less. The storm eating everything past that boundary like it had never existed at all. Somewhere in there she couldn't have said, when time had stopped meaning much of anything, she became aware of a shape moving toward her through the white. A person. Not a person. Hope. The cow had left the huddled shelter of the herd and come to stand beside her, broadside to the wind, forming a windbreak with her own enormous body that cut the worst of the gale before it reached Odessa's back. Odessa laughed, a short, disbelieving, half-hysterical sound that the wind stole away almost before it left her mouth. "You're supposed to be hiding," she shouted, not sure the animal could hear her over the roar. "Not standing out here playing nursemaid to me." Hope didn't move. "Fine," Odessa said, quieter now, mostly to herself, driving the last staple home with numb, shaking hands. "Fine, stubborn animal, we match, I suppose." She finished the last stretch of wire an hour before dawn, though dawn itself gave no visible sign of arriving, the sky staying the same bruised gray it had been all night. She stumbled back to the house on legs that had stopped being reliable. Somewhere around hour 3, fell through her own front door, and lay on the kitchen floor a long moment simply breathing, unable yet to manage the climb to a chair. The fence held. Every single animal survived the night. She learned that for certain only at first light, walking the line half frozen still, counting heads through blowing snow until she'd counted 39 and could finally let her shoulders drop. 39. Not 40. She never stopped counting the ones she'd lost, not even in victory. But 39 alive, breathing steam into a white morning that should, by every reasonable measure, have killed at least a few of them. She sat down hard in the snow, right there, too exhausted to make it back inside just yet, and let herself cry for exactly as long as it took to feel the cold seeping back through her coat, which wasn't long. There was never enough time that winter to feel anything all the way through before the next task came calling. The doubt came later that week, once the adrenaline had worn off and left only the ache behind. It came at night, the way doubt generally did, sitting at Caleb's table with the ledger open in front of her and the numbers refusing, no matter how many times she added them, to come out any kinder than they had all winter. Because what if this was foolish? What if the whole town had been right from the very start, and she'd simply been too stubborn, too proud, too unwilling to admit defeat to see it plain? A woman alone. A herd nobody else wanted. A debt climbing steady while her body wore itself down mending fentence in blizzards that could have killed her twice over already, easily without anybody the wiser, until spring thaw revealed the truth of it. She caught herself spiraling and made herself stop. Physically stood up from the table, walked to the window, pressed her palm flat against the cold glass the way she'd pressed it flat against that iron brand back in October. Except 39 animals were alive in that pasture, who had no earthly right to be alive, by every prediction made in that gravel lot. Except Ezra Boone, a man who'd spent 40 years around herds like this one, had looked her dead in the eye and told her this bloodline might be worth more than she could currently imagine. Except Hope had walked out into a blizzard unasked, unbidden, and stood broadside to the wind, just to cut the worst of it before it reached her. That wasn't foolishness. She didn't fully know what it was yet. But she knew, standing there with her palm against the cold glass and the wind still testing the shutters outside, that it wasn't foolishness. Whatever Red Hollow wanted to keep calling it. She went back to the table, picked up her pen, started the numbers over from the top, the way Caleb always told her to when a column refused to balance, not faster, not angry, just steadier, and this time, somewhere near the bottom of the page, they came out just barely, narrowly, survivably kind enough to let her sleep. Ezra came out once the roads cleared, 3 days later, and found her mending the same stretch of fence again, because the storm had loosened what she'd driven in during the storm, and there was always, it seemed, another stretch of fence. He watched her work a moment before saying anything. "You look half dead," he said finally. "Feeling better than I look, then? That an insult to how you look, or a compliment to how you feel? Take it either way you like." He almost smiled. Almost. Ezra Boone didn't smile easy. She'd learned that much about him over the winter. But something in his face shifted that came close enough to count. "I've been doing this kind of work 40 years, he said. "Conservation herds. Sick stock, half-wild animals nobody else wanted to touch." He nodded toward the fence line, toward the herd beyond it. Steady now, grazing what thin winter grass they could find. Never seen anyone hold a herd like this together through a storm like that one. Not alone. Not without losing half of them. Amos wasn't out here that night. Wasn't talking about Amos. He followed her gaze to where Hope stood, watching them both from 20 feet off, unbothered, chewing steady. Ezra was quiet a moment. "That animal's attached to you." "Seems to be. That's rare. Rarer than you'd think with wild stock." He crouched to check a hoof on the nearest yearling, businesslike again, though something in his voice stayed thoughtful. "I've read about herds that bond that close to a single handler. Old accounts. Conservation programs mostly, up near the territory line, before most of them folded." He glanced up at her, wondered more than once, watching this bunch, whether they came from stock like that originally, the way they move, the way that old cow leads. Odessa's pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. "What would that mean?" she asked. "If they did. Means somebody once thought this bloodline was worth keeping careful track of." Ezra straightened, slow hand pressed to his back. "Means whatever you've got standing in that pasture might be worth a great deal more than $800, Mrs. Kane. To the right people. And the wrong people." He held her eyes a beat. "Wrong people already seem to suspect it too, judging by how hard Thorncroft's been working to make your life difficult since October." Neither of them said anything further on the subject. Didn't need to. The thought sat between them plain as the fence post. Odessa's hand still in it, and they both let it sit there, unspoken. The way you leave a thing alone once you've said enough of it out loud to know it's true. Before he left that day, Ezra paused by his horse a moment longer than the goodbye strictly required. "I lost a herd once," he said, not quite looking at her. "Conservation outfit up near the territory line. Watched the whole program fold inside one bad season. Animals scattered to whoever'd take them cheapest. Years of careful breeding undone in about a month's time." He gathered the reins. "Told myself afterward I was done. Done caring that hard about something that could be taken away that fast." "What changed?" He glanced back at the pasture, at Hope watching them both, unbothered, chewing steady in the thin spring light. "Watching you," he said simply. "Man gets tired of being done with things eventually. Starts looking for a reason to care again, whether he goes looking for it on purpose or not. He swung up onto the horse before she could find an answer for that, and rode off without waiting for one, leaving Odessa standing at the fence line with something unfamiliar and warm sitting where the doubt had been the night before. Spring came slow that year, grudging, like the season itself couldn't quite decide whether to commit, but it came. Snow receded off the ridge in patches. Green pushed up thin and stubborn through last year's dead grass. The herd's coats, dull and patchy all winter, began filling in, not fully, not yet, but enough that a person looking close could see the difference between a starving animal and a merely thin one. Odessa kept her notebook full through those months. Weights, foraging patterns, which cows showed early signs of carrying calves. She wrote it all down with the same careful attention. Caleb used to give his own numbers, because somewhere along the winter, she'd stopped thinking of the notebook as a widow's desperate bookkeeping and started thinking of it as something closer to proof. Evidence, though she couldn't yet have said evidence of what, exactly. She drove into the county seat in April on an errand that had nothing to do with feed or fencing for once, because the brand wouldn't leave her alone. Hadn't left her alone all winter, sitting under her palm on that ridge back in October, and every quiet hour since had left room for the question to grow louder instead of fading the way most questions eventually fade. She went to the county records office. Nadine Pruitt ran that office the way Odessa suspected she ran most things in her life, thoroughly, without complaint, and with a memory for paper that bordered on unsettling. Late 30s, sharp-eyed hair pinned back severe enough to suggest a woman with no patience left over for anything but the task directly in front of her. The records office smelled like dust and old ink, and the particular staleness of a room that saw more paper than people. Odessa stood at the counter, turning her hat over in her hands, feeling, not for the first time that year, like she'd wandered into a room built for a different kind of person entirely. Iron Crown, she repeated when Odessa finally worked up to asking the question plain. What exactly am I looking for? I don't rightly know. A brand, shaped like a crown, might be tied to a herd somebody kept years back. Nadine considered this a moment, tapping one finger against the counter, and then disappeared into the back room without another word, the particular silence of someone who took a puzzle personally. She was gone the better part of an hour. Odessa waited, watching dust motes turn slow in a shaft of April light through the front window, trying not to let her hopes climb higher than the situation had any right to support. Nadine came back with a single yellowed page held flat between two fingers like it might crumble if she gripped it any harder. Found this buried in an old quartermaster file. 6, maybe 7 years back, near as I can date it. She set it on the counter. Shipping manifest, meat and hide contract, supplying a border outpost up near the territory line. Odessa leaned over the page. Faded ink, official stamps, columns of numbers she barely registered because her eyes had already caught the name printed across the top. Iron Crown Herd, Frontier Conservation Program. She read it twice. A third time, to be certain the words weren't rearranging themselves out of sheer wanting. What's a conservation program doing supplying meat to a military outpost, she asked, voice not entirely steady. Common enough from what little I know of it. These outfits ran breeding stock to keep a bloodline alive, sold off the surplus for income, kept the program funded that way. Nadine tapped the page. This one dissolved. Financial trouble looks like, going by the paper trail that dries up right after this date. Whatever became of the herd after that, she shrugged. Not in any file I've got access to. Odessa stood very still, staring at that name, because if this was the same herd, if the crown-shaped brand on her cows was the same crown printed on this fading government page, then Caleb's silence made a shape it hadn't had before. Territory line, border outpost. A man who'd gone quiet for a stretch, years before he met her, and come back changed, careful about things he hadn't been careful about before. Can I take this, she asked. Copy it more like. Original stays with the county. Nadine was already reaching for a fresh sheet and a pen. Mind telling me why this matters so much to a rancher I've never once seen in this office in 2 years? Odessa considered how much to say. Decided, in the end, on the truth, or near enough to it. Because I think my husband knew something about this herd he never told me. And I think Barnaby Thorncroft knows it, too. Nadine's pen paused over the paper. That's a dangerous pair of names to say together out loud in this county, Mrs. Kane, I'm aware. Just so you know I heard you say it. Nadine finished the copy, slid it across the counter. Man like Thorncroft doesn't get where he is by leaving loose ends lying around unattended. You go pulling on this thread, you'd best be ready for what unravels. I've been ready since October. Nadine studied her a long moment, something like respect creeping into an expression that had started the conversation purely businesslike. "Then good luck to you," she said. "You'll need more of it than most." The letters surfaced 2 weeks later, and not because Odessa went looking for them. Amos found them, of all people, going through a box of old freight receipts he'd inherited when a rival trucking outfit folded and sold off its records for scrap paper. He drove out to her place, still holding the box. In a way she'd learned meant trouble. "You'll want to see this," he said, before he'd even climbed down off his wagon. He handed her a bundle of correspondence, weeks old, addressed between the Salt Fork ranch manager and a man signing himself J. Slate, Blackthorn Range and Beef. Odessa read them standing right there in her own yard, the spring wind pulling at the pages, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather, because the dates didn't lie. Judd Slate had written to Salt Fork's manager weeks before the liquidation had ever been announced publicly, inquiring politely about the herd's disposition, suggesting, not so politely underneath the politeness, that Blackthorn Range would be interested in acquiring the animals quietly, privately, before word of the sale spread and other buyers came sniffing around, which meant Thorncroft had known. Long before that gravel lot auction, long before his front row laughter, his shovel joke, his public bet that the herd would be dead by the holidays, he hadn't been mocking a worthless herd out of simple cruelty. He'd been trying to scare off every other buyer so he could scoop up something he already understood was value. Cheap, quiet, with nobody the wiser. And Odessa's impulsive paddle, raised before she'd finished deciding to raise it, had wrecked that entire plan in the space of about 30 seconds. "He's been lying since the very first day," she said, mostly to herself, the letters trembling slightly in her hand, not from cold this time. "Looks that way," Amos agreed, grim. "Question is what you aim to do with knowing it." Odessa folded the letters carefully, tucked them into her coat pocket, beside the quartermaster manifest. She still carried everywhere now, like proof she needed to keep physically close or risk it dissolving. "Nothing yet," she said. "Not until I understand the whole shape of it. A man like that doesn't get caught by half a plan. I need all of it." "And Caleb," Amos said carefully, watching her face. "You think he's part of the shape too? I think he's the middle of it." Odessa looked out toward the pasture, toward hope grazing calm in the distance. "Man doesn't stay quiet. 2 full years of marriage over nothing, Amos. He stayed quiet over something he thought was dangerous enough to keep entirely to himself. Question I can't answer yet is whether he was protecting me from it, or protecting it from you." She looked at him sharp. "I don't mean it unkind." Amos said, "Quick, hands up. Just you're not the only one in this county capable of putting 2 facts next to each other, Odessa. Man goes quiet about a valuable, near-extinct bloodline. Comes home changed. Never speaks a word of it, not even to his own wife." He shrugged, uneasy. Maybe he wasn't hiding it from danger. Maybe he was hiding it because he didn't fully trust what you'd do once you knew. The suggestion landed harder than she expected. She turned it over a long moment, unwilling at first to let it sit anywhere close to true. Except she remembered, now that she let herself remember it properly, how careful Caleb had always been about certain conversations. How he'd steer them elsewhere, gentle practiced. Whenever talk turned toward the old wildlife programs, the territory line, anything from before their marriage that touched too close to whatever door he'd built and sealed shut. She'd never noticed the steering while he was alive. Only now, looking back with new eyes, could she see the pattern for what it likely was. "I don't know which it was," she admitted finally. "Protection or distrust. Maybe both at once. Man's allowed to be more than one thing, I suppose, same as anybody." "Reckon that's true." Amos climbed back up onto his wagon. "Just be ready for either answer, is all I'm saying. You go digging this deep, you don't always get to choose which truth comes back up with the shovel." Summer arrived hard and dry, the drought the forecasters had warned about all winter finally making good on its threat. The small ponds Odessa relied on shrank week by week. Neighboring ranches began selling off portions of their own herds just to keep the remainder fed and watered, and Odessa watched the sky every morning the way a woman watches a door she's expecting bad news to walk through. The well failed on a Tuesday in July, with 11 cows visibly close to calving and not one single spare dollar in her account to fix it. She stood over the dead pump a long while that morning, hand resting on cooling metal, feeling something close to despair for the first time since the auction. Because a well pump wasn't fence wire, wasn't something she could mend herself with borrowed tools and stubbornness. It needed parts. Parts needed money. Money was the one thing this whole endeavor had never once had enough of. She cranked the handle once, twice, out of sheer stubborn hope that maybe it had simply jammed, maybe it wasn't truly finished. It didn't so much as groan back at her, which meant it was finished. Which meant 38 adult animals and 11 cows heavy with calf now depended entirely on however much water Odessa could physically haul by hand. In a summer already shaping up to be the driest the county had seen in a decade. Except giving up wasn't a real option either. Hadn't been since October. So she rigged what she could, holding tanks, a borrowed water trailer from Amos, trip after trip, hauling water, while the sun beat down and the grass browned, and 11 cows grew heavier and closer to their time with every passing day. She learned to read the sky the way other women read scripture. Learned which low corners of the pasture held moisture a day longer than the rest. Which shade patches shifted where by which hour. Learned to ration her own worry the same careful way she rationed the herd's water. Because there was no version of that summer that allowed her to fall apart in front of anyone, and precious little time even to fall apart alone. Some nights she hauled water until well past dark, arms shaking, blouse soaked through with sweat despite the cooling air, and she'd stand at the tank afterward, listening to 38 animals drink, like the sound itself was something worth staying awake to hear. "Don't you dare," she told the sky once, low, half a threat and half a prayer, watching heat lightning flicker uselessly along a horizon that refused to deliver a single drop of the rain it kept promising. "Don't you dare take a single one of them now. Not after everything." The sky predictably didn't answer. The first calf came at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the pump failed, in the worst possible hour, the way these things always seem to arrange themselves. Odessa knelt in the dirt beside the laboring cow with a lantern clenched awkwardly in one hand, watching for every sign Ezra had walked her through on his last visit. Weeks earlier, the two of them crouched together beside a different cow, while he'd explained it slow and thorough, knowing this day was coming. The position of the legs, the rhythm of the contractions, the narrow, terrifying window where patience turned to danger, and a person had to know, absolutely had to know, which side of that window she was standing on. The birth went easier than she'd feared. When the calf finally slid free onto trampled summer grass, Odessa sat back hard on her heels and simply breathed a while, letting relief and exhaustion move through her together, indistinguishable from each other by that point in the night. The calf's coat carried a strange reddish copper cast under the lantern light, and Odessa found herself seated for what felt like the first time in weeks, watching him find his wobbling legs. 17 more followed over the coming weeks. 18 calves total, born into a drought that should, by every hard fact the county's older ranchers kept repeating to anyone who'd listen, have killed half of them before they'd drawn 100 breaths. It didn't. Odessa slept in broken stretches through those weeks, always half listening for trouble out in the dark pasture, and she watched something remarkable happen that no amount of reading Ezra's borrowed textbooks had prepared her for. The herd, her herd, thin and half-starved just months before, began finding water and shade and shelter in a landscape that, to every human eye surveying it, to offer none of those things. Low-lying patches that still held moisture, long after everything around them had turned to dust. Plants no ordinary cattle would have bothered testing. Word of the calves reached Red Hollow the way word of everything eventually reached Red Hollow, faster than seemed physically possible for a town that size. Odessa felt the shift the next time she went in for supplies. Della Ashworth was at the dry goods counter again, same as always, but the tone had changed some, and Odessa noticed it before Della had gotten 3 words out. 18 calves, Della said. Not quite a question. That's what I heard. Right. In this drought, that's right too. Della studied her a long moment. The particular assessing look Odessa had grown so tired of absorbing all winter, except this time it carried something new underneath it. Not quite respect. Not yet. But something that had stopped being purely pity. My herald lost 6 head to the heat already, Della said, quieter now. Good stock, too. Proper cattle, not. She stopped herself, seemed to reconsider the sentence she'd been about to finish. How are you managing it? Truly. Not being unkind, asking. Odessa considered the question, and considered, too, how much of the real answer she wanted to hand over to a woman who'd spent all winter calling her poor thing behind a raised hand. Hauling water by hand, she said finally. Rotating pasture so the grass never gets grazed to nothing. Watching close. That's the whole secret, if you want to call it one. Watching close and not giving up when watching close gets hard. Della didn't have a quick answer for that. For possibly the first time since Odessa had known her, Della Ashworth simply nodded, slow and let the silence stand, instead of filling it with something sharp. Odessa left the store that day feeling, for the first time in nearly a year, something other than braced for the next comment. It wasn't victory, wasn't anything close to it, not yet. But it was a small crack in a wall that had stood solid against her since the day she'd raised that paddle, and she'd take a crack over nothing at all. They're built for this, Ezra told her, watching a cluster of calves shelter in the shadow of the ridge during the worst heat of one August afternoon. Built for exactly this kind of country, exactly this kind of hardship. Most commercial stock loses that instinct after a generation or two of easy management. This herd never lost it. Because somebody bred them not to lose it, Odessa said slowly. The Iron Crown program, if that's truly what they are. Ezra looked at her steady. You still haven't found anybody who can confirm it properly. I know someone who might. Thaddeus Merrick had spent 40 years buying and selling hides before the trade collapsed out from under men like him. Hunters and traders both. Once the great herds that used to blacken the plains had been shot down to almost nothing in barely a decade. He'd turned his hand to something gentler in his later years, advising, consulting, helping what few conservation efforts remained, try to identify and preserve whatever bloodlines had survived the slaughter. He was an old man now, spare and weathered, with the particular stillness of someone who had witnessed something enormous die and had never quite finished grieving it. He came out to Odessa's ranch on a blistering afternoon in late August, at Ezra's urging, and spent the better part of 2 hours simply walking the herd in silence, running his weathered hands over hides, checking conformation, studying the fading brand on animal after animal, with an intensity that made Odessa's chest go tight watching him. I remember the winter it turned, he said at one point, not quite to her, more to himself, or maybe to the herd itself. 1873-74 thereabouts. Hunters everywhere. Whole outfits working the plains from spring clear through winter, and the herds just, he made a small gesture, a hand opening, releasing something invisible into the hot air. Gone, millions, down to scattered pockets, inside not much more than a decade. I bought hides through most of it. Made my living off it, if I'm honest, before I understood fully what we were doing. Is that why you stopped? I stopped because one season I couldn't find enough hides left worth buying to justify the trip out. His mouth twisted, not quite a smile, took the animals themselves running out to make me stop. Not conscience. I've had to live with that a long while now. Odessa didn't have an answer for that, and didn't try to manufacture one. Some confessions didn't want comforting, they only wanted witnessing. When he finally spoke again, his voice had gone rough. I bought hides for the outfit that supplied that outpost, he said, tapping the copy of the old manifest Odessa had brought out to show him. Years back, before it dissolved. He looked up at her. Iron Crown wasn't just any conservation herd, Mrs. Kane. It was one of maybe 3 programs left in this whole territory still trying to breed pure stock, unmixed with domestic cattle, back when everybody else had already given up and let the last herds interbreed or die out entirely. And this is that herd. Near as I can tell, without laboratory work, nobody in this county has access to. Yes. I'd stake what's left of my reputation on it. He shook his head slowly, looking back out over the pasture, at calves wobbling on new legs in the shimmering heat. I never expected to see a group this size, this intact, standing in one pasture again in my lifetime. Thought the whole bloodline had scattered to nothing when the program folded. What's it worth? Odessa asked, and hated slightly how practical the question sounded, even though practical was the only thing she could currently afford to be. More than you'd believe, to the right people. Conservation funds. Breeding programs desperate for bloodlines this clean. He met her eyes, and considerably more trouble than you'd like, to the wrong people, once word gets out what you're sitting on. Define wrong people. Anyone who understood the value of this bloodline before you did, Mrs. Kane, and hoped to acquire it quietly. Anyone whose whole business model depends on nobody else standing in that pasture, asking the questions you're currently asking. He gathered his hat, ready to leave, then paused. You said your husband might have known something about this herd. I believe he did. Then I'd wager he knew exactly what I just told you, which means somebody wanted that knowledge kept quiet badly enough that even a married man never spoke a word of it to his own wife. Merrick held her eyes, steady, serious. That's not the behavior of a man protecting a secret out of simple modesty, Mrs. Kane. That's the behavior of a man protecting somebody from danger. Odessa thought of Judd Slate's letters folded still in her coat pocket. Thought of Thorncroft's laugh in that auction room, and how little of it, she now understood, had actually been about mockery at all. Word's already half out, she said quietly. I think it has been since October. The notice arrived from the county 3 days later, delivered by a boy on horseback who wouldn't quite meet her eyes handing it over. And Odessa read it standing in her own doorway with the August heat pressing at her back. A proposed railroad corridor, the notice explained, in the careful bloodless language such notices always employed. Surveyed route running directly through the northern and eastern boundaries of her property. Public hearing scheduled for September. Landowners along the corridor advised that eminent domain proceedings could, under certain circumstances, supersede existing title. She read it twice. A third time, hands going cold despite the heat, because she recognized the shape of this. Recognized it the same way she'd recognized the shape of that ring of starving animals back in October. Some things you simply know on sight, without needing every detail spelled out first. This wasn't really about a railroad. She folded the notice, careful, precise, and walked back out toward the pasture, where Hope stood grazing in the shimmer of late-day heat. 18 calves scattered around her like something out of a dream. Nobody in Red Hollow had believed possible 10 months ago. He's coming at it from a different angle now, she said, mostly to herself, mostly to the cow who couldn't answer but seemed, as always, to be listening anyway. Couldn't buy me out, couldn't starve me out, couldn't scare me out. She looked north, toward the boundary line the notice had described, toward the direction she now understood without a shred of doubt that Barnaby Thorncroft's next move was already arriving from. So now he's going to try to legislate me out instead. She saw him 3 days later on the county road, driving past her gate slow enough that it couldn't have been accidental. He didn't stop, just slowed, met her eyes through the open window of his carriage, and offered the smallest nod, almost courteous, the kind a man gives an opponent he respects enough to no longer bother pretending otherwise with. Odessa stood at her gate and watched him pass. You knew about the railroad before that notice ever got typed up, she said, though he was already too far off to hear her. The words meant more for herself than for him. Didn't you? Same as you knew about this herd before that auction ever got called. The carriage rolled on, dust settling slow behind it in the still evening air. She thought about Judd Slate's letters, about the manifest with Iron Crown printed clean across the top, about Merrick's warning that's not the behavior of a man protecting a secret out of simple modesty. That's the behavior of a man protecting somebody from danger. And about Caleb's silence. 2 full years of marriage. Not one word. Whatever her husband had been protecting her from. Whatever Thorncroft had spent a decade making sure stayed buried. It was rising now, whether either dead man's plans accounted for it or not. Rising the way water finds its way up through frozen ground, once spring finally stubbornly arrives. The herd grazed on around her, unbothered. 18 calves and 38 grown animals standing steady on land that had nearly killed half of them 10 months back and was, against every prediction made in that gravel lot, thriving instead. Odessa folded the notice into her coat pocket alongside the letters, alongside the manifest, the small growing collection of proof she was building one careful piece at a time. The hearing was close now, and so she suspected was the fight that would finally decide the whole of it. Nadine sent word within the week. Come to the office. Bring nothing. Just come. Odessa drove in that same afternoon, the notice about the railroad corridor still folded in her coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from how many times she'd taken it out, and read it again like the words might soften on the 20th reading. They hadn't. The office was quiet when she arrived, dust motes turning slow in the September light through the front window, same as they had that day back in April, when she'd first come asking about a crown-shaped brand and left with a name that had cracked her whole understanding of her own marriage wide open. Nadine met her at the counter, with a look Odessa had learned to recognize by now. The look of a woman who'd found something and wasn't sure yet whether it was good news or worse news, dressed up to look like good news. The corridor survey, Nadine said, no greeting at all. I pulled the original filing, compared it against the county's authorization ledger, and in the survey was commissioned in June. Filed, stamped, dated June. Nadine turned the ledger around so Odessa could see it herself. Except the railroad company itself didn't authorize any survey work in this county until August. I checked with a clerk I know over at the territorial office. Written confirmation. Nothing on paper before August. Odessa stared at the 2 dates a long moment, letting the shape of it settle into place. So somebody filed a survey, she said slowly, for a railroad corridor that didn't officially exist yet. Somebody filed it 2 months before the company that supposedly commissioned it had any legal right to commission anything. Nadine's mouth was a thin line. That's not a paperwork error, Mrs. Kane. Errors don't usually land exactly 2 months early and exactly along one specific property line. Whose signature's on it? County surveyor's, official enough on its face. But the request that started the whole process. Nadine flipped to another page, tapped it once. Requested by a private party. Paid for by a private party, man named Judd Slate. Odessa closed her eyes a moment. Because of course. Because it was always Slate's name somewhere in the paper trail, wasn't it? Every time she pulled back one more layer. Slate riding to Salt Fork before the auction. Slate riding past her fence line, scouting. And now Slate, apparently, paying to fabricate a railroad survey 9 months before the railroad in question had bothered to actually exist. He's not clever enough to build this whole thing alone, Odessa said. No, Nadine agreed. He's not building anything. He's executing, which means somewhere behind him. Thorncroft, I can't prove that part. Not on paper. Man's careful enough never to sign anything himself. Nadine closed the ledger. But I can prove the survey's fraudulent. I can prove the dates don't hold up to a single honest question. That's enough to stop the September hearing cold if you're willing to stand up in front of the county and say so out loud. Odessa looked down at the copied pages. Nadine had prepared for her the false survey, the real authorization date, laid side by side, plain as anything. I'm willing, she said. She rode out to Amos's place that same evening, and then to Ezra's, and by the time she'd finished explaining what Nadine had found, both men were already reaching for their coats. County fairs the last week of September, Ezra said, thinking out loud. Every rancher in 3 counties comes through it. Livestock judging, breeding stock on display. He looked at Odessa steady. You bring that herd there. Merrick assesses them in front of everybody who matters in this territory. Nobody can call it a rumor once it's standing in a judging ring with 300 witnesses watching. And the survey? Bring that too, Amos said. Man wants to steal land with a fake railroad. Let him try explaining a forged filing date in front of the same crowd. Odessa sat with that a moment, feeling the shape of a plan finally taking hold after nearly a full year of simply reacting to whatever Thorncroft threw at her next. He'll be there, she said. Thorncroft. He shows every year. Judges half the categories himself or as good as. Then let him, Ezra said. Let him stand right there and watch. Word reached Thorncroft before the fair did, the way word always seemed to travel faster than the actual event in Red Hollow. He came to her gate himself this time, no note, no invitation to his office. Just his carriage rolling up the drive on a cool September morning, with Judd Slate seated stiff and silent beside him. Odessa met him at the fence. You've been busy, he said. No greeting. So have you. Filing surveys for railroads that don't exist yet. Something in his jaw tightened, just barely quick enough that a person not watching closely might have missed it entirely. I don't know what you think you've found, he said. I think I've found a date that doesn't match, Mr. Thorncroft. I think a county surveyor's going to have some uncomfortable questions to answer at that hearing, and I think you know exactly which questions those are, or you wouldn't have driven out here at 7 in the morning to warn me off asking them. I came to offer you one final chance to walk away clean. I've heard that offer before. $90,000, if I recall. 150, he said flat. Land and herd both. Today. Before the fair, before the hearing, before whatever it is you think you're about to prove in front of half this territory. Odessa looked past him at Slate, who hadn't said a word, hadn't even lifted his eyes from his own hands folded tight in his lap. Mr. Slate, she said. You look like a man carrying something heavy. Slate said nothing. That's enough, Thorncroft snapped. Before his operations, man could open his mouth at all. He turned back to Odessa, something colder now working under the smooth surface of his voice. You think you understand who you're standing in the middle of. You don't. Some doors, Mrs. Caned open kindly once you finally get them unlatched. You said something close to that once before, she said. About my husband. Silence. Real silence. This time, the kind that has weight to it, that sits in the air between two people like something physical. Ancient history, he said finally, echoing his own words from that dark-paneled office nearly a year back, though something in his voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried the first time he'd said it. We'll see about that, Odessa said. September's coming, Mr. Thorncroft. Whatever door you've been holding shut this whole time, I intend to be standing right there when it finally opens. He didn't answer. Turned his carriage around instead and drove off without another word, Slate riding beside him rigid and silent the entire way down the drive, and Odessa stood at her gate watching them go feeling something in her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite triumph either, something closer to readiness. The county fairgrounds filled early that last week of September, wagons and carriages lining every road for a half-mile in every direction, the air thick with dust and roasting corn, and the particular electric hum of a whole territory's worth of people gathered in one place at once. Odessa hadn't slept much the night before. Lay awake running the plan over and over, the way she used to run Caleb's numbers, checking for anywhere the whole thing might come apart under pressure. Because this wasn't a quiet fence mended in a private pasture where only she and Ezra would ever know how close it had come to failing. This was 300 witnesses. This was Thorncroft, cornered, and a cornered man with that much money behind him could still do considerable damage on his way down. She'd gotten up before dawn anyway, dressed careful. Not for vanity, she'd never much bothered with that, and Red Hollow had made certain over 2 years that vanity wasn't a comfort available to a woman built the way she was built. She dressed careful because she understood, walking into that paddock, that every eye in the territory would be measuring her again, same as they'd measured her in that gravel lot 11 months back, and this time she intended to give them something steadier to measure. Odessa arrived with the herd at dawn, before the crowds thickened, and walked them into the judging paddock herself, hope leading, calm, steady, the way she'd led every difficult passage of the last 11 months. Merrick met her there. So did Ezra. So did Nadine, arriving with a leather folder tucked carefully under one arm, the false survey and its true dates copied out clean and ready. By mid-morning, word had spread through the fairgrounds the way it always spread, and a crowd began gathering around the paddock ranchers, mostly men who understood exactly what they were looking at. Once Merrick started his assessment out loud, in front of all of them, instead of quietly on Odessa's own land, where nobody but her had been there to hear it. Pure stuff, Merrick announced, moving through the herd slow, deliberate, his voice carrying across a paddock gone unusually quiet, unmixed with domestic cattle, near as 40 years of experience can judge it. Confirmation matching program records I personally handled hide contracts for more than a decade back. Iron Crown Herd, Frontier Conservation Program. He held up the copied manifest for the crowd to see. This is not simply a rancher's herd, gentlemen. This is one of the last intact pieces of a bloodline this territory allowed to nearly vanish entirely. A murmur ran through the crowd. Odessa felt it before she fully heard it. A shift in the air, the particular sound of an assumption breaking apart in real time. Because these were the same ranchers, some of them, who'd laughed loudest in that gravel lot 11 months back. She recognized faces, recognized the particular discomfort now crossing some of them, watching Merrick's hands move over animal after animal, with the same reverence you'd show something sacred. Look at the condition on them. Someone near the front said low, mostly to the man beside him. Through that drought we just had, my own stock lost weight all summer, and these look better than they did in June. Better than better, another voice added. Look at the calves. 18 calves, weaned now, sturdy, moving through the paddock with the same watchful discipline Odessa had noticed in their mothers nearly a year ago, back when nobody else had thought to look closely enough to see it. Thorncroft arrived just before noon, exactly the way Odessa had known he would, moving through the crowd with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life expected a room to turn against him. He watched Merrick's assessment finish out, watched the crowd's reaction, and when Merrick stepped back, satisfied, Thorncroft stepped forward instead, smooth as ever, already reaching for the narrative before anyone else could claim it. Remarkable animals, he said, loud enough. Genuinely remarkable. Though I'd remind everyone gathered here that remarkable and lucky aren't always the same thing. A woman inherits 40 starving animals by pure accident of an auction gone strange, and now we're meant to believe she engineered all this through skill? A few uneasy laughs. Not many. Fewer than he'd clearly expected. Ask your operations man, Odessa said, stepping forward, whether accident had anything to do with it. Every eye in the paddock swung toward Judd Slate, standing near the rail, still and pale, the way he'd been standing since Thorncroft's carriage rolled up that morning. Judd, Thorncroft said, low warning. Slate didn't move. Tell them, Odessa said, quiet, not tell them about the letters you wrote to Salt Fork's manager weeks before that auction was ever announced. Tell them why you were trying to buy this herd quiet and cheap before the whole county had a chance to bid on it fair. The silence stretched, long enough that Odessa began to wonder whether Slate would simply refuse, whether the whole moment would collapse into nothing more than her word against Thorncroft's, exactly the way Thorncroft had clearly gambled it would. Except something in Judd Slate's face finally cracked, some years' worth of carrying weight he hadn't asked to carry alone finally giving way in front of 300 witnesses. "It's true," he said. His voice came out rough, unpracticed, nothing like the smooth reports he must have delivered to Thorncroft 100 times over the years. "I wrote those letters. On his instruction." He wouldn't look at Thorncroft now, kept his eyes fixed instead, somewhere past the crowd entirely. He knew what that herd was worth before the auction ever happened. Knew about the Iron Crown bloodline. Told me to scare off other buyers quiet-like, so we could take the whole lot for nothing. Once the price collapsed, his jaw worked a moment. Didn't count on her raising that paddle. Nobody counted on that. "That's a lot," Thorncroft said, too fast, too sharp. The smoothness finally, visibly slipping. "It's not," Slate said, and something in his voice now carried real weight. The sound of a man finished protecting somebody who'd never once protected him back. 15 years, Slate went on, quieter now, like the crowd had fallen away, and he was speaking only to Thorncroft himself. 15 years I've done whatever you asked and never once questioned the shape of it. Told myself it was just business. Told myself somebody else would have done it if I hadn't." He shook his head slow. "Watched you offer that woman $90,000, knowing full well what she was actually sitting on. Watched you buy up every scrap of hay in the county, just to starve her out quiet, where nobody could call it cruelty because you never once raised your voice doing it." His eyes came up, finally, and met Thorncroft's straight on. "I've got copies of my own. Kept them in case a day like this ever came. I'm done carrying this alone, Barnaby. Whatever it costs me." The crowd had gone entirely silent now, 300 people watching a man's careful decade of quiet manipulation come apart in a single public morning. "And the railroad," Odessa said into that silence, nodding to Nadine, who stepped forward with her leather folder already open. "This survey," Nadine announced, holding up the county filing for the crowd, claims authorization dated this past June. Except the railroad company itself has no record of commissioning any survey work in this county before August. 2 months difference. Filed exactly along one property line. She looked out over the paddock. "I'd invite anyone here with connections at the territorial office to confirm it themselves. I welcome the scrutiny." Nobody stepped forward to defend the filing. Nobody, Odessa noticed, was even looking at Thorncroft anymore, not with the open respect they'd shown him walking into the fairgrounds that morning. Merrick spoke again, quieter now, but the paddock had gone so silent. His voice still carried clean to every corner of it. "There's one more matter worth this crowd's attention," he said, and something in his tone made Odessa's chest tighten with sudden apprehension, some instinct warning her this next part hadn't been part of any plan she'd made. "I've spent this whole year comparing grazing data, herd condition, calf survival, land recovery, across every operation in this territory, willing to share their records with the County Stockmen's Association." He looked at Odessa, including "yours, Mrs. Kane, which your Dr. Boone was kind enough to provide me." Odessa hadn't known that. Glanced at Ezra, who gave her the smallest apologetic shrug. "Highest calf survival rate in the territory this year," Merrick said. "Best land recovery following the drought, by a considerable margin. Lowest feed cost per animal of any operation this size." He paused, let that settle a moment. "Including Blackthorn Range and beef, whose own numbers, provided reluctantly, show calf losses nearly triple the territory average, and pasture recovery, among the worst reported this season." A new kind of murmur moved through the crowd now. Not disbelief this time. Something closer to reckoning. Because these were ranchers, practical people, who understood numbers better than they understood speeches, and the numbers Merrick had just laid out plain in front of them said something no amount of Thorncroft's careful reputation could talk its way back around. The widow everyone had mocked in a gravel lot 11 months ago wasn't merely lucky. She was, by every measure that actually mattered in this business, better at it than the man who owned 11,000 acres and had spent a decade pretending otherwise. Thorncroft stood very still in the center of all that silence, and for the first time since Odessa had known him, she watched something in his composure genuinely fail to hold. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. "A survey error, an operations man exaggerating his own importance to save face. None of this proves. There's one thing more," Odessa said, cutting through it, quiet, steady, the way she'd learned to be steady over 11 brutal months of practice. "Something you started to tell me yourself nearly a year back in your own office. About my husband." The color drained slightly from his face. "Not here," he said low. "Here," Odessa said, in front of the same crowd that just heard everything else. He looked around the paddock, at 300 watching faces, at Slate standing pale and finished lying beside him, and something in his shoulders finally gave way. The last posture of a man who'd run entirely out of doors left to shut. "Your husband worked for the Iron Crown program," he said, quiet, none of the earlier smoothness left in it at all. "Kept the books. Good with numbers, careful. The kind of man an operation like that needed." He looked away, out past the crowd, out towards some middle distance Odessa suspected wasn't really there at all. "I was a silent backer, one of several. And when the program's finances turned difficult, I saw an opportunity to force a collapse and buy the surplus stock cheap once the other backers panicked and pulled out. And Caleb figured it out. He found the discrepancies in the books faster than I expected any bookkeeper to find them." Thorncroft's jaw worked. "Threatened to expose the whole scheme to the other backers. I made certain he understood what that exposure would cost him. Not violence, I've never dealt in that. Ruin, instead. His name, his prospects, anywhere in this territory, finished if he pushed the matter further. So he stopped pushing. He left instead. Took what stock he could quietly arrange to have moved off before the worst of it, scattered them to smaller operations where I couldn't easily trace them, and disappeared from that whole business entirely." Thorncroft finally met her eyes again. "I didn't know he'd settled here. Married. Built a life 2 counties over. Not for years. By the time I understood who you were, Mrs. Kane, whose widow you'd become, the land was simply land to me by then. A piece I wanted for entirely separate reasons. A pause, heavier than the rest. It was only once you bought that herd that I understood what you'd actually come into." Understood, he must have known all along. Exactly where at least part of that scattered bloodline had ended up. Close enough that he could have kept a quiet eye on it, if he'd wanted to. Close enough that maybe some part of him never fully let go of that old fight, even after he stopped talking about it. Odessa stood with that a long moment, feeling something in her chest finally settle into a shape she'd been reaching for since that ridge last October. "Why threaten his own life's work over money?" she said, mostly wondering it out loud rather than truly asking him. "You already had 11,000 acres. You didn't need whatever that collapse handed you." "No," Thorncroft admitted. And for once there was no performance left in his voice at all, just something tired and plain. "I didn't need it. Wanted it. There's a difference a man doesn't always let himself see clearly at the time." He looked down at his own hands a moment. "I was younger then. Told myself opportunity that doesn't get taken is opportunity wasted. Took me a long while to understand what a small, ugly kind of hunger that actually was in Caleb." "Did you ever think of him again after he left?" "Every time I looked at this land," Thorncroft said. "Every single time. Told myself it was only ever about the acreage. Easier that way." He met her eyes one final time. "Wasn't only that, though. I expect some part of me always understood exactly what I'd cost that man and never once found the nerve to make it right while he was still living to see it." The crowd around them had gone utterly still. 300 people watching a decade-old debt finally come due in the open air of a public fairground, and Odessa realized, standing at the center of it, that she felt something she hadn't expected to feel at all. Not triumph, not even fully anger, though anger was in there somewhere, banked low. Something closer to grief. A fresh grief, arriving late. For a husband she thought she'd already finished grieving. For a version of him she'd never gotten the chance to know, the young man who'd stood up to a wealthy man's greed and paid for it with everything, except his life, and then carried that cost silently for the rest of his days rather than ever once let it touch her. "He never told me," she said, mostly to herself now. "But he never really let it go either. Did he?" Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. Thorncroft left the fairgrounds without another word to anyone, Slate following a distance behind him, and Odessa watched his carriage pull away through a crowd that no longer parted for him with the same easy deference it had shown that morning. He didn't look back. She understood, watching him go, that he wasn't merely losing this fight. He was losing something considerably harder to rebuild than a survey filing or a piece of disputed land. He was losing the one thing men like him depended on more than money: the county's willingness to keep believing whatever story he told them. The September hearing never happened. Word reached her a week later, secondhand, the way most county business reached her. The surveyor himself had withdrawn the filing, rather than answer questions about it in front of a board that had just watched him publicly exposed as fraudulent in front of 300 witnesses. No corridor, no hearing. No further mention of eminent domain, Not that year and not any year after it. She didn't sleep well that night either, though this time it wasn't fear keeping her awake. She sat again at Caleb's table, the same lamp, the same worn wood grain under her hands, and let herself finally cry, the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry back in that paddock, in front of 300 watching strangers. Because he'd carried that alone. 2 full years of marriage, and every quiet evening at this exact table, some part of him had been sitting with a debt he'd never once set down where she could help him hold it. She wasn't angry at him. She'd expected, somewhere along this whole strange year of digging, that anger might be waiting at the bottom of it. It wasn't. What waited instead was something gentler and sadder, both at once a fuller understanding of the man she'd married, the whole shape of him finally visible, not merely the parts he'd felt safe enough to show her. "You should have told me," she said quiet, to the empty kitchen, to the lamp, to whatever remained of him in a house he'd built with his own hands. "I'd have carried it with you. Wouldn't have been so heavy, split 2 ways instead of 1. The house didn't answer, the way houses don't. But something in the saying of it out loud eased a weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying too, all these months, without a name for what it was. She blew out the lamp eventually, and slept finally, deep and dreamless, for the first time in longer than she could easily recall. The line of ranchers began forming at her gate the very next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, wagons stretching back along the county road further than Odessa had ever seen gather for anything in Red Hollow. They hadn't come to laugh this time. They'd come with deposits, requests, questions about breeding rights and calf reservations and the rotational grazing methods Merrick had described to the whole fairgrounds. Some of the same men who'd laughed loudest in that gravel lot 11 months back stood now with hats in hand waiting their turn, same as everyone else. Della Ashworth's husband was somewhere in that line too, she noticed, along with half a dozen other faces she recognized from that first terrible day. Harold Ashworth reached the counter she'd set up on the porch and stood there a moment, turning his hat over in his hands, plainly uncertain how to begin. "Lost 6 head this summer," he said finally. "To the heat. Wife told you that already, I expect." "She did, wondering if you'd consider taking on an apprentice come spring. Not asking special treatment, just asking to learn how you did what you did." He met her eyes, something like humility in it that hadn't been there a year back. "Whole county's been doing this wrong, seems like. Might as well learn from whoever's doing it right." Odessa didn't rush any of it, that whole first morning, or the weeks that followed. Set her own terms, careful, deliberate, the way she'd learned to be careful about everything that mattered this past year. No calf sold before it was old enough to leave its mother safely. No buyer approved without proper facilities to keep the bloodline healthy going forward. Priority given to smaller operations, honest conservation efforts, people trying to build something rather than simply acquire it. She handed Harold the same application she'd handed everyone else that morning. "Everyone waits their turn," she said, "but I'll teach anybody willing to actually listen." He nodded and moved on, and the line kept coming, steady, all through that morning and into the next several weeks, until Odessa's own applications outnumbered the calves she actually had ready to place. When Cobb Whitfield, the same auctioneer who'd muttered did 40 walking corpses under his breath the day he'd sold her that herd for $800, finally reached the front of that line, hat in hand same as everyone else, Odessa didn't say a word about the past. Just handed him an application, same as she'd handed every other man before him. "Everyone waits their turn," she told him, "same as anybody." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant by it, and didn't argue. By the following autumn, the ranch bore a new name, painted careful and unpretentious across a fresh sign at the gate: Iron Crown Prairie Ranch. Nothing grand about the lettering, just true. The pastures had recovered dramatically through that year, thick native grass swaying green and gold under a September sun, a sharp contrast to the still struggling ground on some of the neighboring properties that had never learned the rotational methods Odessa had stumbled into out of pure necessity. Ezra had become the ranch's regular veterinary consultant by then, out most weeks, though the visits had long since stopped feeling like big and started feeling like something closer to friendship, unhurried, easy, built slow across a hard year. Neither of them had expected to survive quite this well. He'd taken to arriving a little early most days now, lingering a little longer than the herd strictly required, and Odessa had started noticing it, and had started, if she was honest with herself, looking forward to it more than she'd admit out loud to anyone just yet. "You're smiling," he told her once, watching her check a yearling's coat in the autumn sun. Don't recall you doing that much this time last year. Didn't have much cause to this time last year. Cause enough now? She considered the question, considered him, standing there patient and steady, the way he'd been steady through nearly every hard turn of the last 2 years. Working on it, she said, and let the small smile stay right where it was. Amos ran the growing transport operation, hauling calves to buyers across 3 counties now, instead of just the 2 trips that had started this whole impossible year. Nadine helped Odessa build a proper record-keeping system, transparent, careful, tracking every single animal from birth through sale, the kind of thorough documentation that made certain no man's fabricated survey would ever again quietly reshape the truth of what belonged to whom. Odessa kept the old auction paddle mount on the barn wall, number 47 still faintly visible along its worn edge. A quiet reminder of exactly how completely this whole county had once believed she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Some evenings she still walked the fence line alone, after the ranch had gone quiet for the night, running her hand along steel wire that had replaced the sagging, patched-together barrier that had barely held through that first desperate winter. She thought, on those walks, about the auctioneer's voice, calling out $800 to an emptying room, about Thorncroft leaning close enough to murmur that he'd take everything from her by spring, about Caleb and the silence he'd carried, and the reasons for it she finally understood now, fully. The way you understand something only after you've walked the whole distance of it yourself. None of it had felt like triumph while she was living through it. It had felt like one hard decision after another, made in the cold, made afraid, made anyway. On a clear morning in late September, a full 2 years after that gravel lot auction, Odessa stood at the top of the ridge behind her house and watched the herd climb toward the tree line ahead of her. Hope led them, same as she always did now, steady, unhurried, moving like an animal that had never once doubted she would see another spring. Behind her came the rest, grown thick and strong through 2 hard seasons, calves from that first drought summer, nearly full-grown themselves now. A herd that had once been 40 starving, rejected animals no one in this county believed would survive a single winter. 40 had become nearly 100 by the time the count settled that year. Odessa stood at the fence and watched them climb, the morning light catching gold across dozens of broad, healthy backs, and she let herself feel finally, without flinching away from it, without immediately reaching for the next task to distract her from it, something that had taken this entire impossible year to earn. Not triumph exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to peace. She thought about the woman who'd stood in that gravel lot 2 years back, arm raised before she'd finished deciding to raise it, absorbing laughter she'd told herself didn't matter, while every part of her chest insisted otherwise. She thought about how many mornings, since then, she'd caught herself hunching her shoulders in a doorway, trying to take up less space than she actually took, before catching herself and straightening, remembering Caleb's voice, "Sit up, Des, you're not in anybody's way. You never have been." She believed that now, fully. Not because anyone in Red Hollow had finally given her permission to believe it. She understood, standing on this ridge, that she'd never truly needed their permission at all. Only her own, and it had simply taken this whole hard, impossible stretch of time to find it. She thought of Caleb one last time that morning, the way she still thought of him most mornings, quieter now, less like grief and more like company. "We made it," she said, out loud, to the wind, to the herd, to whatever part of him might still be listening from wherever he'd gone. "Both of us did. Just took the long way around to finish it properly." The herd kept climbing, unhurried, unbothered, toward open grass and a sky gone wide and clear above the ridge. And Odessa Kane, who had once stood alone in a gravel lot while an entire town laughed at the size of her mistake, watched them go with her chin lifted, her shoulders square, taking up exactly as much space in the world as she had always deserved to take. No more, no less.